Before we begin, I do want to extend my gratitude to Lauren Fialco, who, as always, does such a phenomenal job at doing our tech, um, and has been my partner in crime for so long as a Bernie Sanders delegate and forward, and Brian Black from Roots Action, who's been a tremendous support in all of this. So thank you both. We do have 1 minute. And it is 12:35. This is such an important and critical conversation for us to have. Before we begin, I do want to introduce myself. My name is Hania Jodat Barnes, and I am the National Director of Lift the Sanctions campaign. I want to take this opportunity and welcome you to this space of solidarity with our international communities, Iran, Yemen, and Venezuela. Unfortunately, this pandemic has not only exposed racial disparities in our own country, but it has also shined a light and highlighted our involvement in devastations across the globe, which is what we as activists must speak out against. Over 3 million people have lost their lives as a result of this pandemic. Yet it is unfortunate that privileged countries have hoarded vaccination to ensure that pharmaceutical companies profit. And that today is what we're going to also speak up against. Before we travel to the 3 countries we will be discussing today in terms of sanctions and war, I want to thank the co-sponsoring organizations, Roots Action, Progressive Democrats of America National, Progressive Democrats of America Middle East Alliances, Code Pink Congress, Muslim Delegates and Allies, as well as World Beyond War and Peace Action. And our esteemed panelists who will take us through their journey as people, not only as experts in that region, but people whose stories need to be also highlighted. What happens is after each dialogue, we will move into a Q&A. And then we will host a call to action to contact our Congress members as well as the Biden administration to urge them to end the support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen, as well as lift the sanctions on vulnerable populations, as well as ensuring that vaccination is distributed in countries equally and accordingly to save lives. And that's really pretty much what we're asking for. Again, as I mentioned earlier, I do hope that you have purchased your tickets to the 3 regions. There will be a break time in between, so feel free to get up, get some water. We'll come back and listen to our panelists. I will hand this over to Ryan to introduce Leonardo Flores, as well as Carlos Ron, who is not able to be here with us, but he sent his regards, blessings, as well as a video for us to watch. Ryan, please take it away. I'll step back and I'll enter back when we travel to Iran together.
All right. Thank you so much, Hania. I really appreciate the introduction. My name is Ryan Black. I'm the organizing coordinator with rootsaction.org. Thank you all so much for joining us for our Sanctions and Blockade Day of Action. We're going to be talking about Venezuela first, and we have 2 amazing speakers who are going to be speaking to that. First off, we have Carlos Ron, who is Venezuela's Vice Minister of Foreign Relations for North America and President of the Simón Bolívar Institute for Peace and Solidarity Among Peoples. Now, unfortunately, Carlos messaged us this morning and he got stuck with flight delays and he's unable to join us right now as he planned, but he did record and send us a really great video that we are going to play for you now with his thoughts on the sanctions on Venezuela and what it means. So, Lauren, if you could cue that up for us. And this is Carlos Ron.
Good afternoon. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to be here with you. My name is Carlos Ron. I'm Vice Minister of Foreign Relations for North America of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. I am also President of the Simón Bolívar Institute for Peace and Solidarity Amongst Peoples, and I thank you very much for this opportunity to exchange a bit about the issue of sanctions on Venezuela and how they are affecting us. I want to thank Roots Action, Progressive Democrats of America, Code Pink Congress, World Beyond War and Peace Action for this opportunity to speak to you all. I think that we should first start by asking ourselves, why is Venezuela a target of U.S. sanctions and of this policy? And I think we can basically sum it down to three important issues. First of all, Venezuela has wide, ample resources that are coveted by transnational corporations, and it's been so for a long time. In particular, we have the largest oil reserves throughout the world. So these, as you may, of course, understand the importance of this and why this is an issue that we want to have in Venezuela, a government that is willing to provide these resources in the use of U.S. foreign policy objectives or transnational corporation objectives. Second, since 1999, we started a revolutionary process in Venezuela, which stands out because of its independent foreign policy. And it's an independent foreign policy in the region, which has allowed us to make friendships and new alliances. Because we believe that the world shouldn't be a unipolar world where it's a one issue or a one government-oriented rule, but rather multiple poles of interaction and of concentration of power. And in that geopolitical sense, we believe in strengthening our own foreign policy and our regional foreign policy and creating a space of regional unity, and that allows for our independence, our sovereignty, and our own style of crafting our development. So this, of course, comes as a threat or collides basically with the intentions that the United States foreign policy has on Venezuelan resources and on Venezuela itself, and also on the region. So we are also targeted because we could be a threat in the way that we present ourselves as a different model from the rest of the region that during the times of the neoliberal governments have basically just followed U.S. foreign policy. So that in itself is another important reason. Thirdly, and I think that is also something that we must take into consideration, is that Venezuela plays part in local politics in the United States. Venezuela, right now, there's about 169,000 Venezuelan Americans, more or less, 50,000 of which live in the state of Florida. And if you know in national politics in the U.S., the state of Florida, of course, has an important repercussions in every time there's an election. So that group of Venezuelan Americans who are mostly aligned politically, identified politically with the opposition in Venezuela. Well, the U.S. government feels that they need to cater to these groups in order to obtain their political support. So for those three reasons, I think mainly we're being targeted. Now, we're being targeted by unilateral coercive measures. We don't call them sanctions because in legal terms, international law, as you well know, these are not sanctions because the only legal sanctions under the UN Charter are those that are set out by the United Nations Security Council. So since these are decisions made unilaterally by the United States, under U.S. policy and not by any decision under the United Nations, we find that these are illegal. They violate international law, and that's something that must be kept in mind by the U.S. and by the U.S. public. That supporting these measures is supporting a violation of international law. Sanctions, as a foreign policy tool, are inflicting pain on people. The idea is that they inflict enough pain so that they could provoke some sort of change of government and a change of policy, but out of enough pain on the population that the population will actually go out and turn against its own government, disrespecting local constitutions, disrespecting the local democratic will of the people that elected those governments in the first place. So, and right now, about 30% of the world lives under some sort of a U.S. sanction because in late years, this has been a favorite tool of the U.S. government in order to push countries into the foreign policy that they would like. Sanctions are erroneously, into our understanding, portrayed as acceptable under some sort of false premise where they basically say, well, if sanctions are better than conventional war, and they're not as violent, and they're specifically targeting some people. This is not true in reality and in practice, because people under sanctions, may suffer as much in cases as under war, because you jeopardize their access to food, their access to healthcare, their access to daily basic needs, and then you accompany this with some sort of message where you think that this is somehow acceptable, or this is somehow not creating as much harm as something different. So this is very important that we see this under the government of Trump, who was some sort of a sanction trigger happy government. Well, we see that now the sanctions became the primary tool of U.S. Foreign policy aggression against people around the world, and I'm concerned. We're all concerned, as if this is going to change under a new administration, because you see the people in key positions. For example, there's a man by the name of Richard Nephew, who is now envoy for Iran, who wrote a book called The Art of Sanctions, where he explained precisely that the aim of sanctions are to cause pain and suffering on people, and to promote that change. So I think it's very important that we understand that this is a foreign policy tool that is being, in a way, is misleading people into thinking that this is somehow easier on general populations. Letters have been sent out by Congress in recent months. There's one led by Senator Chris Murphy, another one led by Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. There's even the Gao report that basically show that the effects of these sanctions and the issue that the so-called humanitarian extensions on these orders are not being followed. They say that sanctions are not supposed to interfere with healthcare or with food, but in reality, in practice, there's an issue called overcompliance that comes up. Overcompliance, in this sense, means that companies are afraid to deal with Venezuela, or banks, companies, they're afraid to deal with Venezuela because they think that they're going to be somehow affected, even though they're not specifically violating anything that's written down in any of the executive orders. And I'll give you a specific example with the issue of COVID-19 right now. Many other countries throughout the world are able to easily go out in the market and find, masks or these type of items that are needed to combat and to give protection during the pandemic. In Venezuela, we have a difficulty because many of these companies that could easily provide for us some of these materials, they won't, because they're afraid that they're going to have some repercussions if they do. So then we need to find those that are willing to sell something to us. And when we finally find them, they know in the situation we are, and they probably hike the price 3, 4, 5 times, the natural price on the market, making it even harder for us and more expensive for the country to purchase these items. But even when we actually find somebody to purchase them, then we fall into another problem, is that we can't do the transaction. It's very hard to find a way to pay, because most of the financial system is then locked down for Venezuela. Banks have closed our accounts. Banks have frozen our accounts. Right now, Venezuela has about $5 billion blocked in accounts in the U.S. and all over the world, which is money not from the Venezuelan government. It's not money from Maduro, President Maduro, or any of the government officials, but it's actually money from the Venezuelan people, and that we cannot use in order to buy the things we need, because they're frozen, and because banks, maybe not, they don't even want to deal with the possibility of getting in trouble for doing a simple transaction would be allowing Venezuela to purchase medicine or safety kits in order to combat COVID-19. So this is, were it not for our alliances that we built by having our own independent foreign policy, and with countries like China or Russia or Cuba, if Iran, if it weren't for those alliances, we would have been left out without the possibility of having enough tests for COVID, enough protection gear, material, even enough vaccines. Because I mean, right now, the main source of our vaccines to combat COVID is precisely from Russia and China. So this is something that we need to think about when we think about the impact of sanctions in Venezuela. And I'm going to tell you something that I think is also very important for you to keep in mind. I think the cruelty of this policy is aimed at destroying the positive things that we have built over the last 20 years as a positive move by a socialist government. And I'll give you just one brief example. During the revolution, we built a children's cardiology hospital that is to tend specifically for heart operations for children, and we were averaging between 2010 and 2014, we were averaging about 1,000 interventions per year. This is something that didn't exist before, that we didn't have in Venezuela, and came as a result of the revolution, and it came as a result of a national policy aimed at protecting Venezuelan healthcare. Now, in the last year, in 2020, we went from averaging 1,000 interventions to only 162. You want to know why? Because we couldn't have enough of the material to provide the services, because X-ray machines are shut down, and we can't get them repaired because the companies that are outside of Venezuela that should be the ones repairing these machines, well, they won't come because they're afraid of the sanctions and what could happen to them if they actually come and do service to these machines in Venezuela. So this is the level of cruelty, of viciousness that it causes. I want to leave you just with a thought that I think it's important to understand that sanctions have it's very difficult to sell, the idea of sanctions morally or even practically. First of all, because you are really attacking, countering, making people suffer, and it's something that shouldn't be part of a country's foreign policy. I think, and also because it's illegal, because it breaks with what we as human beings understand as international law, what we wanted to do to avoid wars. It's really a contestation of all of this. And so I think it's important. And I thank you for this opportunity to speak to you, and I thank you for this opportunity to give you some of our testimonies of what we undergo here in Venezuela, because it's been a really difficult time for the Venezuelan people. We will maintain ourselves, strong, committed to our social justice program, to our social justice our process and our social development. But it would be very important for us to have the support of people in the United States that will call out these sanctions for the crime they really are. Thank you very much, and I'm glad to have this conversation with you.
That was fantastic. We thank Carlos Ron for sending in that video for us. Lauren, if you could switch the video back over to me, please. And we will get our next speaker introduced. Let's see if I can. Here we go. All right. Yeah, that was fantastic. Next up, we have Leonardo Flores. Leonardo is a Latin American campaign coordinator of Code Pink. He's worked as an analyst on U.S.-Venezuela relations. He was born in Venezuela and maintains close ties to social movements that have transformed that country. Leonardo, how are you doing?
I'm well, thanks so much, Ryan.
Excellent. We appreciate you being here today. So I guess go ahead and take it away. And then after you're done talking, I'm going to have a couple questions. For anybody who is watching along, please add your questions to the chat, and we will try to address them as best we can during the Q&A session. So without further ado, Leonardo, go ahead, take the floor.
All right, thank you. So first of all, I want to thank Anya and Ryan for inviting me and putting on such a great event, and also thank Roots Action, Progressive Democrats of America, World Beyond War, Peace Action, and all the other sponsors. I'm really honored to be among such amazing company today. And so I'll get right into it. As Carlos mentioned, when we talk about sanctions on Venezuela, what we really mean are unilateral coercive measures. Sanctions is kind of shorthand for that. And unilateral coercive measures is not only the correct legal term, but it's a little bit more precise, because when we think of sanctions, we think, Treasury Department, we think economics, financial sanctions, but it goes beyond that, especially in the case of Venezuela. So for example, the US economic war against Venezuela really started in earnest in 2014 when Congress passed a law called the Venezuela Defense of Human Rights and Civil Society Act. This bill basically called on the Obama administration to impose sanctions. And more than that, it served as a signal to markets, financial institutions, and corporations that Venezuela was about to be targeted by the US government for regime change. So immediately, just with the passage of this law, you have an economic impact that's really difficult to measure because, so for example, risk ratings for Venezuelan debt start to go up, making it more expensive for Venezuela to incur debt and to take out loans. And you start to see some companies start pulling out of the country. In March 2015, you have President Obama issued an executive order calling Venezuela an unusual and extraordinary threat to the United States, which is so ridiculously absurd, of course. I mean, Venezuela has about 30 million people. It's not anywhere, it doesn't represent a military threat to anyone at all. And here you have the President of the United States saying that the country is a threat. But the sanctions really kind of go to a different level during the Trump administration. So in August 2017, he issues a sanction prohibiting the Venezuelan government and the state oil company called PDVSA from accessing international financial markets, which really put a strain on the oil industry because it was unable to take on new debt at a time when it needed to raise money to carry out routine maintenance on all of its oil facilities. Then in 2018, you have sanctions on Venezuela's gold industry and on a burgeoning cryptocurrency industry. In 2019, the Trump administration imposed what the Wall Street Journal characterized as a total economic embargo on the country. And then in late 2020, just as the Trump administration was about to go out the door, they issued a prohibition on diesel swaps, meaning that Venezuela used to be able to trade unrefined oil in exchange for diesel because the sanctions had really crippled its ability to import diesel and to produce diesel on its own. And the Trump administration banned that. And as of a couple of months ago, because of that diesel swap ban, 3 million liters of milk and 20 tons of food were being lost every week. They were spoiling in farms and warehouses. They were unable to be delivered to customers because of a shortage of diesel fuel. So, over the past 7 years now, we've had over 150 sanctions applied on Venezuela, hundreds of sanctions on individuals, also sanctions on ships, on airplanes, on banks, on businesses. It got really ridiculous to the point that one of the final sanctions imposed by the Trump administration was on an Italian businessman, supposedly in the insurance and an insurance agent, but they actually sanctioned the wrong person, and they ended up sanctioning the owner of a pizza parlor in Italy. So all of these sanctions contributed to a 99% drop in oil revenue. And there are estimates that the sanctions and the economic war in Venezuela have cost the country anywhere between $31 billion and $194 billion, a huge amount. But of course, the human cost has been much higher. CEPR, the Center for Economic and Policy Research, a think tank here in Washington, D.C., they issued a study in 2019 that found that in the first year of the Trump sanctions, from 2017 to 2018, 40,000 lives were lost as a result of these sanctions. Later on, a year later, Alfred de Zayas, who's a former UN Special Rapporteur, he estimated that by 2020, the losses had been up to 100,000 people who have died in Venezuela because of the US sanctions. Lina Duhan, who is the current UN Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights, basically on how sanctions affect human rights. She actually went to Venezuela earlier this year in February, and she issued a preliminary report, and I'm going to read a quote. She says, "The economic blockade of Venezuela and the freezing of central bank assets have a devastating effect on the whole population of Venezuela, especially those in extreme poverty, women, children, medical workers, people with disabilities or life-threatening or chronic diseases, and the indigenous population." So the whole entire country basically is affected by these sanctions. Carlos mentioned a report by the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, which is an agency that provides kind of investigative services for Congress. And in that report, they note that US sanctions likely contributed to the steeper decline of the Venezuelan economy, and they admitted that blackouts have increased in frequency and duration since the US began imposing sanctions. I mean, this is kind of a big deal because it was really the first time that the US was officially recognizing the economic impacts of the sanctions on Venezuela, despite the fact that from the beginning, the plan to suffocate Venezuela, to strangle the economy until people rose up against the Venezuelan government, that's been clear. You've had, State Department officials say that on the record time and time again. But here we finally had a different branch of the government, actually assessing those impacts. The latest polls in Venezuela show that 80% of the people are against sanctions. And that's a poll that comes from an opposition-linked pollster. Venezuela is a very polarized country. So even, polling companies are either in the opposition or more, friendly towards the government. And this is from Data Analysis, which is the most important opposition polling firm. And they found that 80% of people are against the sanctions. And that represents really quite a break with kind of the leaders of the Venezuelan opposition, particularly those who are supported by the US financially and logistically, who continue to call for sanctions, and really what they want is a military invasion of the country. Sanctions, of course, are also one of the root causes of migration in Venezuela that yet we never hear about. There's article after article in the Washington Post, New York Times about Venezuela's migration, how it affects Colombia, or Ecuador, Peru, even the United States. And never in those articles is there a discussion of how the sanctions destroyed the economy and for forcing people to flee in search of survival in terms of economics. And as I wrap up, I just over the past couple of months, I've had the opportunity to speak with feminist leaders, labor leaders, and peasant leaders in Venezuela, and to talk about the sanctions and to talk about the hybrid war from the U.S. hybrid war in Venezuela, which is kind of the name that we're given for this economic war and the attempts at overthrowing the government. And so I want to leave you with a couple of quotes. So I spoke to Lorena Jimenez, who was a leader with an organization called Gender with Class, and she spoke to me about the psychological impacts of sanctions. And she said, finding food, finding medicine, it's really hard to live. Finding gas, finding sources of livelihood, that puts a lot of pressure on people. Sergio Requena, who's a labor leader, spoke of the everyday impact of sanctions. And he said, the biggest impact sanctions have had on my life and that of my family is the destruction of our normality, of our daily reality, the routine we had as a family. Angel Prado, who's a peasant leader, said it was like being under attack. It's like a war. The first bomb hasn't fallen here. It's a different sort of war, but it remains a war that affects all of us. And I think the way to understand sanctions for people living in the US, I think maybe the easiest way to understand what it's like to live under sanctions is to kind of reflect on what's happened to us here in the US and really, of course, all over the world in this kind of past year of the pandemic. The pandemic has upended our lives, caused everyone untold stress, and led to hundreds of thousands of deaths. And it's exactly the same thing with sanctions, except in the case of Venezuela, we're talking about sanctions for 7 years. In Iran, we're going to talk about sanctions for 40 years. Cuba, it's been 60 years. So it's like an ongoing pandemic that you kind of learn to live to adapt to it. But even if you learn to adapt, it's not quite the same as being kind of free from the pandemic or free from sanctions. And I'll stop there.
That's excellent. Thank you very much, Leonardo. I appreciate that. We do have some questions from the audience, and then I have several questions as well, if that's okay with you. I guess to start, and I think I might know the answer to this one, is are there any legal actions in courts that can be taken against these unilateral coercive measures? Because they are illegal. Is there anything people can do about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Venezuelan government was in the process of suing the US here in US courts. But then, because of this whole kind of Juan Guaido facade where the US government tried to impose a puppet president, the lawyers for the Venezuelan government actually switched sides and started representing Guaido, and a couple of those cases fell through. Internationally, I know that Venezuela is seeking a judgment at the International Criminal Court because they consider sanctions to be a crime against humanity, a violation of the Geneva Convention. And so I think that's in progress, but of course, the US won't really be affected by a decision by the ICC, unfortunately. So, it's very difficult because when you try to, sue in the US about sanctions, the courts will say that you have no standing. So the Venezuelan government has no standing to even bring a lawsuit. I think there could be lawsuits based from US companies if they chose to do that, but to my knowledge, there hasn't been such an attempt. Interesting. And I'm glad you brought up Juan Guaido. Question about that is it very much is an attempted coup. Is there an idea of how he would change things so that COVID relief could enter the country? Is there any connection there at all? Right. So actually, let me just talk briefly about Juan Guaido and how he came to be. So in late 2017, early 2018, the Venezuelan government and opposition were negotiating a huge political agreement, widespread political agreement in the Dominican Republic. They basically had a draft agreement written. They decided to go back to Venezuela for 1 week to confer with their partners, and then come back to the Dominican Republic with understanding that they're going to sign this agreement that would touch on everything from the economics to elections. In that 1 week interim in 2018, the Trump administration threatened an oil embargo. They said that if if a military coup happened in Venezuela, that they would welcome it. And they also said that they would refuse to recognize upcoming presidential elections in Venezuela in 2018. That was before they had even been scheduled. So already you had the Trump administration, early 2018, kind of dismantling this attempted peace agreement because they knew that in 2019 they would have, the new president of the National Assembly. Basically, the opposition controlled the National Assembly at that point, and they had a rotating presidency between the parties. And then this new president they would have in 2019 was going to belong to the most right-wing party that is, pretty much subservient to U.S. interests. And so then 2018 comes along. There's presidential elections in Venezuela. The U.S. calls for a boycott. Some opposition leaders, participate anyway. But others are told by the U.S. not to participate because they wouldn't recognize the results, even if the opposition won, because they already had this plan to install this extreme right winger Juan Guaido as the president of Venezuela. So since that time, we've had multiple attempted coups. Juan Guaido's kind of star has faded in Venezuela. He had briefly popular among the opposition for a bit, but now his approval ratings are at basically very close to very, very small. And so Juan Guaido now is, there has been an attempt by the government and opposition led by Juan Guaido to secure funding for COVID vaccines, but it's been incredibly complicated. And what we've learned is that the Guaido faction has actually prevented funds being released to the Venezuelan government for the purchase of COVID vaccines and COVID medicines. So they're taking a very kind of active role in harming the Venezuelan population because they see that the strategy is being the same as what the U.S. wants. They want to basically instill the people to rebel against the government, but that's a failed strategy at this point.
Right. Yeah, trying to get the people to essentially have a civil war or something. It's really interesting that you mentioned Trump there. Carlos Ron also mentioned something in his video that Trump was a sanctions trigger happy. And I wanted to ask you, how does that compare to Biden now and Obama before Trump? Because from my recollection was Obama was certainly sanctions trigger happy as well. Has there been was it a huge shift or is it pretty standard, just maybe increasing a bit?
So the key difference between the Obama era sanctions and the Trump era sanctions are that the Trump era sanctions were much broader in terms of, the economics, going after the oil industry, going after the gold industry. During the Obama administration, they targeted individuals, but they actually did it in such a way that they affected the economy as a whole. Because, for example, if you target the president of a country's central bank, that makes it very difficult for the central bank to carry out transactions because that president's signature is on every document. And so banks immediately become wary of whether or not they're actually in violation of U.S. sanctions policy. So the Obama, they were individual sanctions that had a broad impact. Trump was broader sanctions that had a huge impact. And now with Biden, actually, we've gone, he's been in office for about 3 months now. He hasn't sanctioned Venezuela once. I think that's great. He actually removed a sanction, a very kind of technical sanction on Venezuela's ports. And in his first day in office, he signed a directive calling for an evaluation of sanctions in terms of their impact on the global response to COVID. And I was very hopeful that this would lead to sanctions relief, not just for Venezuela, but for Iran and for the 30 plus other countries that are suffering from sanctions. But unfortunately, they've kind of dragged their feet on this, and we've heard nothing else about this review of sanctions.
Interesting. That is a very interesting development with Biden there. So in terms of the vaccines being able to get into Venezuela right now, Carlos Ron mentioned that I'm assuming all of what Venezuela is getting is coming from Russia right now. How short is that falling compared to the need in Venezuela? What percentage are they getting? I mean, I'm sure you don't know numbers, but is Russia able to handle this, or do they really need the help from the U.S. or other Western countries?
Yeah, so Venezuela so far has gotten vaccines from Russia and from China.
Okay.
I think the aid from Russia and China has been incredibly instrumental in handling the pandemic. Right now, the need, Venezuela has actually been doing very well in terms of handling the pandemic compared to its neighbors, as particularly Brazil, which is by far the worst in South America, but also even Ecuador, Bolivia, Colombia are doing very, very poorly. And it's not so much that Venezuela needs aid from the US. What they need is for these funds to be unfrozen because Venezuela has the money to pay for the vaccines. They just can't access the money. But there was actually good news about a month ago that Cuba and Venezuela have come to an agreement where the Cuban vaccine is going to be produced in Venezuela. I think that's huge because I'm not particularly hopeful anymore on seeing sanctions relief within the next few months. So I think Venezuela might be able to solve this problem on its own, but of course that's going to take a lot of time to get these the vaccine manufacturing plants up and running.
Gotcha. That's super interesting as well. Actually, producing the vaccine there, that would obviously be helpful once it's up and running. I have two more questions for you. I got a couple more because they keep popping up in the chat as well. Can you estimate? You gave me some numbers about estimates that were made about U.S. lives lost, or not U.S. lives lost in Venezuela due to sanctions. Can you give me a big number in total? How many lives lost? Can you estimate how many lives have been lost in Venezuela due to sanctions in total?
So in the first year, according to CEPR, it was 40,000. By 2020, according to former UN Special Rapporteur, it was 100,000 people who had lost their lives. And it's hard to pinpoint who dies because of sanctions, of course, but sanctions have these very broad impacts on health and health indicators. So for example, because of the sanctions, maternal mortality has doubled in Venezuela. Undernourishment rose from 2% to 13.4%. And there was actually a measles outbreak in 2019 because vaccines could not be purchased because the funds wouldn't be released. They wouldn't even be released to international agencies like the World Health Organization and the Pan American Health Organization. So that delay in vaccines led to people dying. And I think the most direct victims of these sanctions are some cancer patients and transplant patients. Venezuela had traditionally, if you have bone marrow cancer, we don't have the technology there to actually treat these people. So what had been done traditionally is that through Citgo is a subsidiary of Venezuela's oil company, and Citgo has a charitable wing called the Simon Bolivar Foundation. They would fly people from Venezuela to either Argentina or Italy to receive treatment for bone marrow transplants, other cancers. And that all stopped because of the sanctions. And in fact, now the Simon Bolivar Foundation gives money to the Juan Guaido's political party in Venezuela. So instead of helping people with cancer, they are lining the pockets of Juan Guaido's supporters in Venezuela.
Wow, very interesting. Going back to when you finished speaking, you gave us a couple quotes that were really nice and really insightful. One of your quotes was about the psychological impacts that are put on regular working people in Venezuela. In your mind, what does that lead to? You mentioned it's like essentially like war without bombs being dropped. So is it like these people are living in a war zone and we're going to have similar blowback that has happened in other war zones where bombs are being dropped? What is happening to the psychology of the Venezuelan people because of these sanctions?
Well, Venezuela, especially during the revolution, became a very highly politicized country in the sense that everyone was involved, whether they support the government or not, everyone was involved kind of in the day-to-day life of doing politics. The sanctions have really crushed that. I think you've seen people's spirits are down in Venezuela, but on the one hand, there is still a huge percentage of the population that supports the revolution. And for them, the sanctions really, it's something to resist and to show their resilience against. For others, they're leaving the country. And I think that has a huge psychological impact as well, because you have all these families that are being split up out of the need to have basically people send remittances in dollars to their families. And so I think those long-lasting kind of effects they're going to last for a generation, if not more, because it's going to be very difficult for all of these migrants to come back, even if the sanctions were lifted tomorrow. I mean, if the sanctions were lifted tomorrow, you'd have this huge influx of cash, but it would still take Venezuela years to recover from all of the damage that's been done. I think it's incredibly hard to live under sanctions. And yeah, you're seeing people who are just very wary and tired and really just dispirited, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I would probably feel the same way if I wasn't able to get the basic needs I needed to survive and to fight the pandemic. Got a question from Robert here in the chat. And we're going to get a really good answer on this here in a minute because we're going to move into our action here shortly. But he asks, what can we in the U.S. do to urge lifting of these unilateral coercive measures? Which I think it's good that we say unilateral coercive measures and not sanctions, because they're not legally sanctions because they can't be. So what can we in the U.S. do?
I mean, I think there's a couple of things. The most important thing really is to contact your representative, contact your senators, make it clear that you think that sanctions are an act of war and that sanctions are harming civilians. And harming civilians during a war, it's a war crime, right? So the United States is violating human rights on a massive scale all over the world, particularly in Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, Syria, other countries that are very heavily affected by sanctions, North Korea. And so I think we need to shift that narrative. And the first step, contact your representatives and senators. Second, if you see an article in your local paper, even if it's about Iran, it's about Venezuela, North Korea, and they don't mention sanctions, or they kind of gloss over the impact of sanctions, write a letter to the editor and say, look, we know that sanctions are killing people throughout the world. We have to have an honest conversation about sanctions. They're obviously that the impacts aren't as direct and immediate as bombs, but they are just as deadly in their own way.
Excellent, excellent. Too quick. I know I keep getting questions, but they're good ones. International banking is an issue here because they're not, it's the banks themselves that are holding the money and whatnot. You mentioned sanctions on crypto, which I hadn't heard about. Is crypto maybe an answer to help Venezuela here? Would that not solve anything?
Well, Venezuela launched its own cryptocurrency called the Petro, and the Petro is based on, various reserves of oil and minerals and other factors. And within a month after it was launched, the U.S. sanctioned it and basically prohibited dealing in the Petro for any U.S. persons or banks. And that kind of took the wind out of the sails because we really thought this was going to be a way for the economy to be able to recover even with the sanctions in place. The Petro is still active and it's being used in Venezuela, but its impact has been hampered, impeded by the sanctions. And I think that's the same is going to be true for any sort of cryptocurrency.
Got it. All right. Well, we need to move into our action now, but if you have any closing words or anything you'd like to leave us with, feel free.
Well, no, I really think there is a kind of a change in the narrative in the U.S. about sanctions. The Lift Sanctions campaign. There's also the Saving Lives campaign. There's Sanctions Killed. So we're seeing kind of a groundswell of support for understanding what sanctions actually do, and I'm all for that. And I'm so happy to be here to be able to speak about sanctions. And thank you again for the invite.
Yes, no problem. And I just sent the action doc, but I sent the wrong one. I sent Yemen on accident. Lauren, if you're there we go. Lauren just sent the accurate action doc for us, and we urge you all to go to liftthesanctions.org as well to get involved. Lauren, if you could post that a couple more times as we go. I'm going to post it as well here. Let's see, Venezuela action doc. And I'm going to share my screen real quick and walk you through how we are going to take action right now. Let me find the correct page to share. There's Venezuela. There we go. So here's our action doc. We've posted it in the chat. I urge you all to go there. We have 3 actions that we can take over the next 10 minutes or so before we move into our next speaker and our next country, which is going to be Iran, which is going to be very interesting. The first thing we want everyone to do is to sign our petition to tell Biden to lift sanctions for COVID relief. And this is the official Lift the Sanctions campaign here. So I urge you all to sign this campaign and share it on social media. That is the first link. That is action 1. Action 2 is to email your representative and senators to lift the sanctions on Venezuela during the COVID-19 pandemic. And you can go there by clicking the link on the second doc. This will set you up with a pre-written email that you can add your own words to, but that will go to your representative and your senators right now and urge them to lift the sanctions on Venezuela and other countries suffering extreme hardships during the COVID-19 pandemic. So another super simple action. So far, 2 actions, 2 clicks. Sign that petition, share it as well. Second action, email your representative and senators, urging them to lift the sanctions on Venezuela during the COVID-19 pandemic. And the third action, and also share that one, the third action is a phone call. Call your representative and senators and talk to them. Leave them a voicemail right now. We have a script written on that document that we shared in the chat. And if you need that link again, Lauren should be in there posting it. I don't have my chat open now. Let me get it open so I can see. I got a question from Karen who asked if we could email these docs after. Yeah, after this event, we will email all the attendees these action docs so they can take action and share them afterwards. The phone call is very simple. If you aren't sure who your representative is or your senators, we have links in that doc that you can go and figure out who they are. You can also ask us in the chat and we'll do our best to answer right away. If you know their names, you call the Capitol Hill switchboard at 202-224-3121, and you recite this very simple script, which I will show you right now. Dial it up. You'll get to a switchboard operator. You'll say, for me, I'll say, can you connect me with Senator Young, with Todd Young from Indiana? I'd say, hello, Senator Young. My name is Ryan Black. I live in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Please join us in asking President Biden to lift sanctions strangling the economy of Venezuela and other countries suffering extreme hardships during the COVID-19 pandemic. As a result of U.S. sanctions, Venezuelans struggle with adequate food, electricity, medicine, medical supplies, and COVID vaccines. Sanctions will only prolong this worldwide pandemic. Again, I urge you, please lift the sanctions now. Now, there's a second ask we're making on all of our calls today. I also urge you to support HR 986, the Robust International Response to Pandemic Act in the House and parallel legislation in the Senate. This bill instructs U.S. representatives to the international financial institutions to support a suspension of debt payments to those institutions during the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you. Hang up. Always end with thank you. Little bit more complicated, that second one, but they'll know about it. They'll know what you're talking about, and this will help free up the money that Venezuela needs to fight this pandemic. So we're hearing from people in the chat now saying action done, action done. That is awesome. We're also going to take a little bit of a break. So over the next 6-7 minutes, get those actions in, ask some questions in the chat. If we weren't able to answer your question, I will try to reach out, send some emails and try to get your question answered for you. All right. And I'm going to ask now in the chat, do we have Marcy on now?
Yes, I'm right here.
How you doing, Marcy?
Hey, good. I love all this action.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, we're going to throw it to you here in just a couple minutes. Let's let everyone take a breather for a moment, take a break, make sure they get these actions in. If you are sending those emails in, you can augment that automated email. You can add your own words, your own personal feelings, change the subject line. That stuff's all really powerful. So I urge you to do that. And yeah, glad to see you, Marcy. You ready to talk about Iran?
Yes, I'm with Hania, who's from Iran.
That's right.
You know, a country of 80 million people, a third under 25 or under. We really need to build some bridges here. It's time.
That's right. So for the next couple minutes, take a quick break, relax for a moment, and come back here at 1:30 Pacific time. That's 4:30 our time. We're going to get going on Iran. So yeah, hang tight for a minute, and thank you all for joining us so far. And Lauren, I'm not sure if I'm able to play that. If you can on your end, go for it. David, I've seen your issues. We're gonna get this up on YouTube and on Facebook soon, and we'll make sure to get it sent out and make it available so that you'll be able to see it. I'll take the spotlight from you, Marcy, so we're not just staring at it.
Yo quiero ser una idea realizable por la gente, una cosecha de hermanos, una palabra con manos, una voz que tenga pasos, que camine frente en alto, una historia con futuro, un pasado que es presente porque aún se está luchando. Soy un plan para integrarnos, una
Janet, I see you. Make sure you click this link in the chat here I'm about to send. Aram, I see your question about Iran. Hang tight on that and just post it in the chat once we start talking Iran, okay? If anyone else is having issues getting to that document, let us know, or getting to the script or anything. Janet, I'll email you. I'll email you in just a couple minutes, okay?
Soy el huerto en una escuela, soy un río que han limpiado, que estaba contaminado. Soy la trocha hasta la siembra, voy dispuesto a abrir la brecha para tan inmenso árbol, donde todos reunamos de todos juntos la fuerza ideal bolivariano. Si inventamos un futuro, debemos hacerlo juntos.
All right, Lauren, if we could cut that music and we're gonna get moving on to our next section. Awesome. If you had any trouble with the actions, please let us know. We will send them out. Be sure if you're on the doc, you click the link and then it might show up in another box, and then you click it again and that should get it to show up. So just be sure you do that. Our next country that we are visiting right now is Iran, the wonderful Marcy Winograd will be, did I spotlight you? Spotlight video from Marcy. Marcy Winograd will be taking over for this conversation. So Marcy, whenever you are ready, take it away.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you, Hania. What a fabulous program. I'm taking a tour of the world, but this is such an important issue. I really appreciate you devoting this time to it. I would like to introduce our speaker, organizer. I'm so proud to be her friend and colleague, Hania Jodat Barnes. She is the president of Muslim Delegates and Allies. I met her as a 2020 DNC delegate for Bernie Sanders, and we were both on the foreign policy team and other teams that submitted lots of foreign policy which were incorporated into the platform. Hania is the coordinator of partnerships with Roots Action and the national director of Lift the Sanctions campaign with the Middle East Alliance for Progressive Democrats of America. She was recently recognized by the National Iranian American Council, NIAC, as one of the 40 activists under 40 in the Iranian community. She is relentless in her campaign for change. She is one of the founding members of the Women's Angeles, and she served on the board of Women's March LA and California until 2019. Welcome, Hania.
Thank you. Thank you, Marcy. And do we have Asal Rad here with us today? Asal,
yes. Do you have my video?
I cannot see you. Can we go ahead and spotlight Asal, please? And Marcy, would you please do us the big favor and introduce her?
Oh, there we go.
Oh, well, Hania, I'm going to turn that back over to you. I'm sorry. Because I think that you're in the best position right now.
That's not a problem. Asal, since you're going to be talking about JCPOA, I'll go ahead and introduce you. And I have to say, I am really starstruck right now because you are probably one of the most incredible speakers I've ever met. And your wealth of knowledge is just so immense. So I'm so glad to be sharing this space with you. And it's always an honor to be in your company and your in solidarity with you. Dr. Asal Rad graduated with a PhD in Middle Eastern History from the University of California, Irvine in 2018. Her PhD research focused on modern Iran with an emphasis on national identity and formation and popular culture in post-revolutionary Iran. Asal joined the National Iranian American Council on January of 2019 as a senior research fellow. She works on research and writing related to Iran policy issues and U.S.-Iran relations. Her writing can be seen in Newsweek, The National Interest, Foreign Policy, and Responsible Statecraft. And she has appeared as a commentator on the BBC, Al Jazeera, and NPR. Follow her on Twitter at Asal Rad, and we'll share that with you shortly. I'll hand it back to you, Marcy, to lead Asal in the discussion of JCPOA.
Yes, so Asal, are there any opening remarks that you'd like to make about the Iran nuclear deal and the and relationships between the United States and Iran, Europe, and so forth?
Sure, I'm happy to do a sort of brief overview and then hopefully open it up to more of a discussion and questions and whatnot. But if we're discussing, so obviously we know that there's a adversarial history between Iran and the United States. And part of that is because we're always stuck in that part of the history. Something to always keep in mind is that there's a much larger history outside of, say, 1979 and the embassy seizure and 1953 and the coup d'etat that took out Prime Minister Mossadegh in Iran from the United States, right? Those are the two key moments we always talk about. But before that, there's actually a long history of mutual admiration. And part of the reason for that is it's before the United States started to intervene in Iran. And that starts in 1953, and that's sort of the beginnings of why we have this contentious relationship. But putting all of that aside, there are mutual grievances on these two sides. The thing that is important in looking at the nuclear deal and looking at the JCPOA is that in 2015, when Iran and the United States, with the international community, came to this agreement, it was a break from that adversarial relationship. It didn't mean that we became allies and best friends, but it meant something that was especially important to Iranians, that unlike the sort of rhetoric that we hear in the United States that says, you can't trust Iran, Iran will not abide by an agreement, Iran will not negotiate with the United States, we now have very recent evidence that none of that is true, that Iran sat down at a negotiating table with the United States, had direct negotiations, that we came to an agreement, and that Iran abided by that agreement. And in fact, Iran is not the party who broke the agreement, it's the United States. So whereas we had this rhetoric of sort of mistrust of Iran, in the end, it was ourselves. We were the party that broke the deal. Under the Trump administration in May of 2018, President Trump decided to quit the deal. Now, the reasoning behind that they gave was that they wanted to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. The irony of that being that that's precisely what the deal addressed. We can get into the sort of politics of why President Trump was hell-bent on reversing everything that President Obama did. The Obama-Biden administration's crowning foreign policy achievement was the JCPOA. In terms of non-proliferation, non-nuclear proliferation, experts in the field say it was the strongest non-proliferation agreement in history. And that is what the deal was meant to address. President Biden, when he was a candidate back in 2017, before Trump had even quit the deal, made it a point to say that the deal was never meant to be a catch-all. Right now, when we have discussions, people like to bring in all of these other things, all of these other issues that we want to discuss. But in reality, this is a non-proliferation agreement. That is what it was meant to address. It was meant to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. And in exchange for Iran allowing limitations on its program in terms of how much uranium they enrich, at what level they enrich, further research that they develop in the country, all of those limitations and as well as having very thorough inspections, were based on Iran getting economic relief in return. And there's this talking point that's always used, like the Obama administration gave money to Iran. They didn't give money to Iran. They released Iran's own money. That is a very different statement. Allowing Iran to have access to its own money by unfreezing accounts is not the same thing as giving Iran money. In addition to that, it was about lifting sanctions that are in place not only by the international community, but by the United States. What the Trump administration did is once they quit the deal, they imposed many, many sanctions, which I know Hania will get into. But the key of those sanctions, it was the crux of what they called the maximum pressure policy. And the maximum pressure policy, it was a little incoherent to understand what it was intended to do, simply because what President Trump said himself and what his Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, has constantly advocated for, which is regime change in Iran, didn't really fit. And Trump came out many times saying that he didn't want regime change, that he just wanted a better deal. By every political objective, by every policy objective, maximum pressure is a failure. Iran expanded its nuclear program after the US quit the deal. Iran's behavior that we always like to talk about in the region didn't change. The Iranian government is unscathed. They are not any weaker. The only people who have suffered the brunt of sanctions are Iranian people, ordinary Iranians. And this is the opposite of our stated intention. We say sanctions are not meant to hurt ordinary Iranians. And yet not only are they hurting ordinary Iranians, they're doing so in a global crisis. And probably the most disheartening part of having watched everything unfold is that in a pandemic, the Trump administration, not only did they not relieve sanctions, they doubled down and increased sanctions, knowing that it was impeding Iran's ability to get access to medicines, to essential goods. And, we don't have to go far. Even in the United States, the most powerful, the richest country in the world, at the beginnings of the pandemic, and even now, we're seeing the economic fallout and how people were affected. Now imagine if we were going through the same thing, but our economy was being crippled by a foreign power. How would we be able to combat the pandemic in that situation? And so that is the situation that Iran is under. Now, the Biden administration, the Biden candidacy, when he was a candidate, promised to return to the deal. And this wasn't something that was unique of Joe Biden. And asked in a presidential debate for the Democratic nominees if they would return to the nuclear deal, and this is when you had a large sort of segment of candidates, everyone but one candidate raised their hand. This is a position of the Democratic Party to return to the deal because we know it works. We know it prevents Iran from getting a weapon. We know it's the best non-proliferation agreement that exists. And now we know as a fact that maximum pressure, that the opposite approach does not work. So now we find ourselves in a Biden administration that has promised to return to the deal, but we have yet to do so. Where we are now in terms of the Vienna talks, which I'm sure a lot of people have heard about, is trying to get both parties to return to full compliance. But the key to be able to do that, for Iran, the road to returning to compliance is much more straightforward. Again, it goes back to the same limitations that they had under the deal, something that they can reverse quite easily. The murkier part is the United States and the ability of the United States to actually lift sanctions that are inconsistent with the deal. And what the Trump administration did intentionally to undermine, and we have heard this line, but this is what this actually means. So how the Trump administration tried to undermine Biden's ability to return to diplomacy was taking certain financial entities in Iran, like the Central Bank of Iran, and double and triple sanctioning that. What does that mean? It was sanctioned under different designations. So now you have the Central Bank of Iran sanctioned under nuclear sanctions and then sanctioned again under terrorist sanctions. The reason for that was precisely to make it difficult politically for President Biden to be able to return diplomacy. And the reason I emphasize politically is because legally there is no hurdle. There's no legal hurdle. Legally, the Biden administration can do this. But politically, it is more challenging to do so when you label something terrorist. And that was the absolute intention behind doing that. So now the Biden administration, these teams that are in Vienna are working. There's one group that's working on sanctions and one group that's working on nuclear issues, are working on how to return to diplomacy, how to return to the deal and how to get everybody back into full compliance. And the other key takeaway that I want to just mention before we get into questions is the reason why the timing is so important is there's an election in Iran in June. Now, we saw the difference between a Biden administration, an Obama administration, and a Trump administration, right? They're different. It is the same in Iran. Now, I'm not saying that to say that we have similarly democratic systems. No, Iran is overlaid with an authoritarian power, but they all agree that supreme leader agrees on returning to the deal on diplomacy, which is why Iran was able to enter into the deal to begin with. But if there is an administration in Iran that comes this summer, which is not as prone to diplomacy as the Rouhani administration has been, then that will create a challenge for the United States to return to the deal and return to compliance. That's why this window of opportunity in these talks in Vienna are so important. And it's so important that our lawmakers show President Biden that he has the political support to do so in order to take concrete actions to do so. And something to keep in mind, the Biden administration talks about unity, right? We're at a particularly polarized moment in our politics in the United States. We've seen that quite a bit. This is actually where unity works, because in terms of wanting to avoid conflict, wanting to end endless wars, and wanting to resolve conflicts through diplomacy, there is bipartisan support for it. Both Biden voters and Trump voters want to resolve the nuclear issue with Iran through diplomacy. So really, there's no excuse for us not to be able to do that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sadral. She is with the National Iranian American Council, a PhD in Middle Eastern history. It's a great honor to have you with us today. And now we're going to turn to Hania Barnes, who I introduced earlier. I have a question for you. What do you think? Is it too little too late for the United States to rejoin the JCPOA? That Iran, China, and Russia are now in a stronger alliance as a result of the maximum pressure campaign, and you have forces in Congress, the Republicans pushing Iran Sanctions Act, 1,500 sanctions on Iran. What do you think?
Sal, I believe that question is for you, actually. So if you could, yeah.
Oh, is that question for me? Okay. Sorry. So the question is, how will the U.S., how can
the US, we have this block, Russia, Iran, we have So does Iran really need us that much? Maybe, I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And what about these forces in Congress, the Republicans be president, right? So he's backing this Iran Sanctions Act, talking to people in Congress that just introduced it to keep those Trump sanctions, 1,500 on Iran.
In terms of needing the United States, the reality of our current situation is that, and the Trump administration probably highlighted this more than any other US administration, the power of the US economy is probably greater than the power of its military in terms of how it can impact countries around the world. And so while on one hand we can say, and this is actually rhetoric that comes from Iran, is that, they can, it's a maximum resistance, that they will resist the United States, that they will resist this kind of, really, it's seeped in imperialism, right? To force someone, to force a sovereign state to capitulate. It doesn't matter that it's not a military force. Economic warfare has the same effects on a population. If you're devastating civilians, that's not different than devastating them in a war. And so the US economy still has the power to do so. And in that sense, yes, Iran, it really, they can stay their own way, but ordinary Iranians will suffer through that process. And it will have to be, you have to accept the fact that they should just suffer because the United States wants to use its economic power against that state until they sort of give in to whatever demands the US, has. In terms of the Republicans that are still trying to fight for more sanctions, one of the most interesting things is that Mike Pompeo, private citizen Mike Pompeo, is still for some reason out there talking about this and advocating for this, which, not surprisingly, given the entirety of the Trump administration, and especially Pompeo, is a complete break from all tradition. He is basically undermining the power of the current Secretary of State. And it's not as if there were no other Secretary of States or presidents that existed during the Trump administration who couldn't come outright and do the exact same things, but they didn't, because we, especially in foreign policy, we don't do that. We don't have former administrations that try to undermine future administrations. Of course, the Trump administration is aberrant for so many reasons. This is yet another one. Nonetheless, that is a representation of a minority of what the American people want. It really calls into question the entire state of our own democracy. What is the point of having a democracy and saying that the will of the people is to be carried out if you're just not carrying it out? If Americans voted in droves, which they did in unprecedented numbers in the last election, because they wanted a change in policy, they wanted something to be different. And in this particular case, in the case of the JCPOA, and in the case of potential conflict, there is no question. There's no question. Poll after poll after poll for the last several years have shown a consensus among the American populace, both Democrat and Republican, that they do not want a conflict, that they do not want more wars, that they think that the United States should have stayed in the deal originally, and that now they should return and negotiate through diplomatic channels, through diplomacy. So the fact that you're seeing this sort of block of Republicans still resisting that idea is more a reflection of their unwillingness to listen to their own constituents.
And Asal, before I go into discussing the sanctions, it's really interesting you say that, because you are talking about a party, the GOP, that really doesn't even allow women to have control over their bodies here in this country, yet they are standing in solidarity with the women of Iran when they try to impose these unilateral illegal sanctions. So, but Marcia, I can take it away from here.
Oh, yeah, I was just wondering if Hania talk about the types of sanctions that we do have on Iran and whether they're legal, illegal. We know this is like another form of warfare. We have not done war. So what can we determine about the legality of these sanctions?
Sure. And what I will discuss is going to be piggybacking off of what Asal has talked about. But in order to really understand the sanctions on Iran, we have to historically look at how far they go back to, as it was already mentioned. Unfortunately, sanctions have been a significant component in the US-Iran policy since Iran's 1979 revolution. That toppled the Shah of Iran's regime and then in the 1980s and the 1990s, US sanctions were intended to try to compel Iran to cease supporting acts of terrorism and to limit Iran's strategic power to in the Middle East. And after that, in the 2000s, US and international sanctions focused largely on trying to persuade Iran to agree to limit its nuclear program. The unilateral sanctions that have, as was mentioned already, that have been illegally imposed on Iran and other countries of concern have been used for decades as a tool for the US government and its allies to really topple governments that pose a threat, supposedly, on the region's national security. In other words, countries and allies of the US that do not necessarily are in alignment, right? In May of 2018, when Trump's administration withdrew from the JCPOA, he imposed over about 1,500 extreme all-economic sanctions on Iran related to the nuclear program. But what most people don't understand is there were also secondary sanctions that were imposed. And those were on institutions and entities that conducted commercial or financial transactions with the Iranian government. The sanctions that were placed on Iran were on the central bank, oil, petroleum, energy sectors, food, and a multitude of industries. But it's also really important to recognize that when the sanctions were imposed on Iran, Trump's administration issued a 6-month waiver to over 9 countries to continue purchasing oil, but like India, China, Turkey, Greece, Italy, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Iraq. But with the exception of Iraq, unfortunately, some of those waivers were not renewed when they expired in 2019. It's also very important to, and I will elaborate on this in depth, but the US government, through the Office of Foreign Asset Control, has built exemptions for humanitarian imports, right, into the sanction regime. But these sanctions have largely deterred the international banks from wanting to even, again, as I mentioned, have any financial dealings or transactions with Iran, including those things that are exempted in the humanitarian transactions, due to the fear of the secondary sanctions themselves and the hefty penalties that they have to pay. Unfortunately, since 2018, Iran's currency, rial, has lost over about 68% of its value. And in March 2020, inflation has risen up to 40%, over 40%, and now it hovers around more than 30%, with unemployment now heavily on the rise in Iran. The extreme illegal sanctions on Iran have had the most impact, I would say, on middle-class women, children, and Iranians with chronic illnesses, as well as Iraqi and Afghan refugee populations. And according to the Human Rights Watch, a report by the Iranian analysts and pharmaceutical industry professionals states that the main obstacle to Iran's importing humanitarian material officially exempted from the US sanctions themselves is restricting the means to finance these purchases. Cancer patients, unfortunately children who are suffering from leukemia, have had lack of essential chemotherapy medicine. As well as, there is and based again on the World Health Organization, chemotherapy medicine is also listed as an essential medicine. Patients with rare diseases that required imported medicine from from overseas for the treatment are facing also increasing difficulties accessing and completing their treatments. There also has been a report that there have been challenges, unfortunately, on finding imported brands of eye drops, for example, in the Iranian market, causing suffering for the large number of patients that have been impacted from eye diseases caused by exposure to chemical weapons and nuclear weapons during the war in Iran and Iraq. Low quality medication is accessible, but unfortunately, there are a number of side effects, in particular, and especially for women who give birth through C-section. It would be remiss for us not to really talk about the disappearing of the middle class Iranian woman who happened to be at the center of reform, fighting for change in Iran. And you know, as we mentioned earlier, the GOP tries really hard to stand in solidarity when they impose these sanctions on the populations that are vulnerable, in particular women. However, what they don't understand or what they ignore is that these sanctions impact women most. Based on a report that was just issued, unfortunately, from March to September of 2020, jobs have been lost over 700,000 for men. 600,000 jobs have been lost for men, but 700,000 for women. And there are a number of women activists in Iran, feminists in Iran, who've been very outspoken about their concerns on these extreme sanctions, stating that the sanctions, not only do they isolate the civil society, but they are limiting and impacting the socioeconomic vulnerable population and limiting women's spaces in political arenas. The other thing that's also really important to mention here is that humanitarian NGOs have also been impacted in Iran, who carry projects, including providing shelter, education for Afghan and Iraqi refugees and migrants. There has been also a mention that the bank's refusal to transfer money to these organizations and to these efforts have been placing these organizations at risk. Unfortunately, with the COVID on the rise right now, as Marcy mentioned earlier, Iran has been in fact impacted heavily. There's an 84 plus million population in Iran. They're a young population, of which 69,000 and over have lost their lives. So, you know, and Marcy, you just mentioned the legality of these sanctions, and I'm more than happy to address this also. Unilateral sanctions used by the US and its allies violate a number of treaties, international treaties and obligations and UN resolutions, and some of which include the Vienna Declaration of Program of Action, a number of Human Rights Council resolutions, as well as cultural rights ruling by the International Courts of Justice, and findings by the UN Committee on Economic. We must also not forget that the sanctions that are imposed by the president are under the 1976 International Emergency Powers Act, which allows the president to declare national emergency without congressional approval. So we have to also have a very broad look at reforming this and reclaiming effective congressional control and oversight over these powers, right? I do want to bring in and introduce Dr. Bill Honigman, who will talk about vaccination and vaccine apartheid in Iran and the countries that are of concern. So Dr. Honigman, please take it away.
Oh, well, thank you. Thanks so much, Hania, Marcy. Wonderful forum, and thanks to organizations who sponsored this and terrific speakers. Hania asked me to speak a little bit to first the general concept of vaccine apartheid, and what are we looking at in terms of inequities, perhaps overall in terms of dealing with the pandemic from country to country, but also I would add domestically, right here on our own shores. So I would just take a couple of minutes then to throw out a few concepts, and then again, kind of turn it back to you all who are more experts, certainly in dealing with as it applies to Iran in particular. But let me just kind of define a couple of things. Like I would say vaccine apartheid we could look at as state-sanctioned inequities, whether intentional or unintentional, in vaccine distribution and access, and that's international or, as I mentioned, within our own borders. And the great crisis, international crisis, of course, with crisis comes great opportunity. So if we look at COVID as a crisis, as an international crisis, it has, of course, reached every corner of the planet, killing more than 3 million people worldwide at this point. It's garnered the pandemic designation by the World Health Organization early on in its onset, long before the development of effective vaccines even. And the vaccine rollouts in particular have largely depended on a country's particular wealth, or to developing countries have depended on a degree of international cooperation, in particular through the COVAX system, which is recognized now as a terrific cooperative effort, but has been kind of plagued with substantial delays due to financing, and in particular intellectual property restrictions, and misinformation and production delays, of course, have hampered equitable vaccine rollout worldwide. So a couple of then principles that come into play would be the humanitarian dictate that, in particular, say, occupying powers must ensure healthcare for populations that they control. And so that's absolutely certain and well recognized, but not actually in practice around the world. And there would be a consensus that it would be deplorable that high-income countries and other nations that produce or hoard vaccines and restrict availability or withhold them to force developing nations to comply with non-COVID related policy goals be recognized as something that needs to be corrected. So this altogether has resulted in a push within, especially those countries like here in the United States, to get those countries wealthy enough that may in fact have an excess of vaccine, and in countries again like the U.S. That have either had an occupying influence or be allied with countries who are occupying other states, that they in fact remove sanctions and allow availability of vaccine and other COVID-related medical equipment and supplies, waive intellectual property rights, such as with the so-called TRIPS waiver, which is the trade-related aspects of intellectual property waiver. That, of course, needs to be relieved because we have no intention of granting a welfare state to pharmaceutical companies in this time of international and domestic need for the purpose of making a profit off of the vaccine. And then lastly, I would just comment that domestically, meaning here on our shores, the vaccine apartheid exists, and it's equally egregious and abhorrent. In particular, our traditionally underserved population in our rural communities and inner city BIPOC communities, of course, continue to be behind in terms of becoming fully vaccinated, and also in the full spectrum of COVID and non-COVID related healthcare, which can only come about, we can only correct, of course, by having a universal healthcare that has to come from a unified method of financing, such as Medicare for All. So thanks again. Those would be my general observations. I turn it back to you, who are experts on Iran in particular, to apply that. And also a shout out to Progressive Democrats America. And you all can, of course, join us for our weekly National Healthcare Emergency Town Hall every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Pacific. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Bill. Maybe I can put in a link in the chat to your call. That's fantastic every week on Medicare for All. I know that also Public Citizen is pushing for and ramped up production on the part of the United States to meet the needs of so much of the world that is suffering, as you said, under this sort of medical apartheid system. I'd like to throw out a question at this point that has been nagging on me, and that is, I read that there is great optimism about the rejoining the Iran nuclear deal, even though there are these Republicans, as Dr. Brad mentioned, they're in the minority with clamoring, trying to, that the Biden administration is looking at lifting a lot of the sanctions, hundreds of these sanctions, there are 1,500 in all, right? But is having trouble, I'm not sure why, with lifting sanctions that relate to the designation of the Iranian National Guard as a terrorist organization. I was wondering if one of you might want to comment on that. Why are they having trouble with this, and what's the implication? What's the significance?
You want me to do it? Okay. Well, what I would say is the challenge isn't, again, the challenge isn't legal. The challenge is whether or not we want to, and the political costs to doing so. So for instance, the idea of a terrorist designation, we put them and lift them basically at will, right? The MEK is a prime example. The MEK is a terrorist organization that was designated a terrorist organization by the United States until some years ago, until it lobbied to be removed. And it's one of the organizations that has killed Americans in Iran in the past, in the 1970s, and still carries out terrorist attacks inside of Iran. This is a group that says that they want regime change in Iran, and the sort of irony of it is that if you look at the cultish makeup of the group itself, it doesn't look like its intention is to bring any form of freedom or democracy into the country, despite the fact that it uses those talking points. During the Abraham Accords, which was the idea of creating relationships between Israel and other Arab states in the region, one of the fruits that was dangled in front of, I believe it was Sudan, was to removal from terrorist lists, right? So this idea that we have a terrorist list, I mean, we can get into the entire politics of the word terrorist itself, which we don't have time for, but it's a completely loaded term. We obviously don't use it to designate anything by a definition. If someone is adversarial, they're terrorists. If they're not, they're something else. So, but putting that aside, that is within the president's power to do so, just like it was within the president's power to add the IRGC to the terrorist list. And again, the reason behind it is to make it, the reason why the Trump administration did it was to make it more complicated to be able to lift certain sanctions that are then tied to what is a terrorist organization now, which is a sovereign state's military, like it's a wing of the military. But really, again, it's a question of political will and the sort of rhetoric that we use and why it's so difficult to get through that. No example is greater than the deal itself, right? We have dealt with, and Hania will know this, anybody who's Iranian American especially, because of your heritage, you notice much more when someone is saying something bad about Iran or about Iranians especially. And so as Iranian Americans, we have experienced this sort of antagonism towards Iran for decades. It's my entire life existence has been to notice this type of rhetoric from the United States. And we always talk about the anti-American rhetoric in Iran, which is problematic, certainly nothing that should be validated, but neither should it be in the US. So when we use that kind of reciprocal rhetoric, it's equally problematic. And it's because Iran has been so vilified, because we have this idea that we have to have an enemy combatant at all times, that it makes it so much difficult to do something that's extremely straightforward. that we know that the deal worked. We know that it prevented Iran from getting a weapon. That's what everyone in the international community wants. But here's this slow motion trying to get it done. Why? It's only because of the vilification that comes with this kind of language. When you dehumanize people, when you dehumanize entire populations, that's how you can carry out these double standards in the way that we approach our foreign policy. So really, that's all it is. It's rhetoric.
And
double standard is right. You know, you think about the United States $753 billion budget. And in that budget for the military budget is upwards of 30 billion to produce new nuclear weapons that will cost nearly 2 trillion over the next decades while we're negotiating this deal. I mean, it's the height of hypocrisy. That's my 2 cents. All right, I want to turn it over to Ryan Black of Roots Action, who has a question.
Absolutely. Hania, did you have anything to follow up on that question there?
Well, I just, kind of wanted to to go back on what Asal was talking about. There are some positive steps that are being taken right now in terms of the discussions in Vienna. We also have to understand that there has been 1,500 sanctions imposed on Iran. I can't even wrap my head around that number at this point. From what we understand, 800 of those are subjected to be lifted. But to your point also, Asad, which is really concerning, is we have now Secretary Pompeo meeting with lawmakers to push for the Iran Sanctions Act, which is being introduced by Representative Jim Banks of Indiana, right? So from what we understand, President Rouhani is also very optimistic, stating that we're in progression, 60 to 70%. This is looking really great. But what we have to do really as citizens here is push our congressional members, our senators, as well as President Biden, to not only join the JCPOA before the Iran election, preferably, but also urge the Congress to sponsor and support bills like the HR 986, which has tremendous support, a bill authored by Trey Garcia that has the support of the left wing of the Congress. And that bill asks for a robust plan to unfreeze these assets that are being held in banks in foreign countries to allow for vaccinations to be imported, as well as medical devices and so on and so forth. So we have a long way to go, but I'm also very excited about the 2 million people who have signed the petition on the TRIPS waiver, which is from the World Trade Organization, which is a key step to increasing global production of COVID vaccine and treatments. So I feel like we have a long way to go, but we're almost there. So I'll hand it back to Ryan.
Gotcha. And Jim Banks is my congressman, and I don't trust him to do anything. So, okay, interesting question for you. So those who support sanctions pretty much always insist if that sanctions are given enough time and if the international community is on board, that they can be an effective tool to bring about change. Do you have any instance where this strategy worked? South Africa is what we've heard, we hear all the time. It's cited as one of the only cases where sanctions yielded the intended results. Can you tell us why this particular case with South Africa was different and why it did succeed?
Well, I would say there's only a handful of cases, short temporary sanctions that have been effective in changing a regime's behavior. An example of that would be probably United States versus India from 1965 to 1967, or United States versus El Salvador, where in 1988, United States used economic sanctions to block El Salvador from releasing those accused of killing U.S. citizens. I think to put the victory of toppling the apartheid regime of South Africa, and I'm by no means a an expert of sanctions in South Africa, but I would say to put the toppling of the government of South Africa solely on sanctions would be an insult to Nelson Mandela's movement, the Black African movement, as well as the African National Congress. The toppling of the apartheid regime also had a great deal to do with the divestment from students internationally, in particular those who staged protests and walkouts at UC Berkeley, in solidarity with Nelson Mandela and the anti-apartheid movement. But also I feel like in terms of South Africa, the pressure also applied from international communities, and for it was more about a public image and opinion at the end of the day. And Asal, if you'd like to add on to that, I'll end with this. Why not take Iraq, for example, in the 1990s, where the sanctions starved children to death? And Leo mentioned in the previous segment that sanctions are used as tools to starve, and they work. They're weapons of war. The difference is that they starve and they prolong the pain, right? Whereas bombs, when they detonate, you're done, right? A life is taken in a minute. But putting a sanction and starving children for a long period of time should be considered an act of war. It's not at this point, and hopefully it will be at one point, but that it didn't happen and didn't work in Iraq, where you have a number of children dying. So Asal, I don't know if you wanted to add to that or not.
Yeah, I would actually want to add a couple points. One is that in the case of South Africa, and this example gets used all the time, in the case of South Africa, the campaign for sanctions was advocated and tied to an indigenous political movement within South Africa. Black Africans were actually the ones advocating for something based on a movement that was happening domestically inside of South Africa. What you hear very often, the voices that you hear saying that we should put sanctions on Iran, many of them, the majority of them, are external from Iran. So to compare the two, to say that, hey, if there's in fact, when there are, there's a lot of people who are opposed to diplomacy with Iran, who, if you talk about reformists and hardliners in Iran, will reject that entire notion outright and say, oh, it's all the same thing. Paint them all with the same brush. As if Mousavi, who was the 2009 candidate in the Iranian election that was contested, is not still under house arrest in 2021. As if there's nothing that happens domestically that's politically divisive in that country, and you can paint the entire thing with one brush. And in fact, it is external powers that should decide the fate of the Iranian people or the Iranian nation. So there is the fact that it's a false equivalency for that reason. Additionally, and Hania, I think, pointed to this a little bit, is advocating for sanctions that decimate a civilian population are not the same thing as targeted sanctions that are used to actually target a government. And there is a way of using targeted sanctions, but that's not what we're doing in this case. What we're doing is trying to crush an entire civilization for the purposes of forcing them into the streets, putting them in a violent confrontation with the state. Right? And this is, again, coming very often from the outside of the country. The people who don't have to pay the price for it are the ones sitting there and telling other people to put their lives on the line for it. And that's why the case of South Africa is quite different. Those people were putting their own lives on the line. In addition to that, in the case of Iran, the first part of the question said this, it was, well, advocates of sanctions say that you just need enough pressure. With just enough pressure, we can do it. They have been saying the same thing for 42 years. For 42 years, the idea that Iran, the Islamic Republic, is on the brink of collapse has been an ongoing statement. Now, if I say the exact same thing every year for 100 years and it eventually happens, that doesn't mean that I was right. That just means I am willing to sacrifice whoever, the lives of innocent people, because I am trying to reach a political end. But this narrative has been repeated over and over again. What's fascinating is no one ever thinks, what if you tried a different approach? What if instead of just constant pressure, you actually tried a different approach? And after 4 decades of failing at this approach, maybe it's time to try a different approach. And that's why advocacies of diplomacy say that that's a better version. The invasion of Iran by Saddam Hussein in 1980 was based on the premise that he could collapse that regime very quickly. It did not work. And so this is the problem with that narrative. But if you actually listen to the moderate reformist voices in that country, they were the voices who wanted the deal. You know, we talk about the GOP in the United States and the fact that they're opposed to the deal. There are people in Iran opposed to the deal in the government. They're called hardliners. So that's your mirror. The mirror of the GOP is hardliners in Iran. It's the exact parties that we say are the most oppressive or the most corrupt. They're the ones who benefit from sanctions when they're in place, while ordinary Iranians suffer. But it was ordinary Iranians who voted in millions in 2013 and in 2017 for the Rouhani administration based on the promise of detente and economic relief from the United States, relief from sanctions. One of the first few initiatives that the Iranian government took after the JCPOA in 2015, one was a $20 billion order of planes from Boeing. That's an American company. And the reason I say that is because with all of the anti-American rhetoric you hear, pragmatically, that's not what happens. The first thing they did is a $20 billion deal with an American company. One of the second things that they did in Iran is to issue visas, like in-airport visas for about 50 different countries. What is the indication of that? It's a country that's trying to open itself up. And what we did is close it off again. So this argument that if we just put enough pressure, but that hasn't borne fruit. It hasn't worked. And we've tried that over and over again for decades.
And somehow, Asad, something in me always tells me that the reason why Iran is so vilified in that region is for America to get away, for the US imperialism to be able to get away with adding to the weapon sales and expanding on that budget every single year, because somehow we end up posing a threat in that region of the world. And going back in history, seldom anyone from Iran has ever done anything on American soil that poses a threat to our lives here. So I will pass it back to Ryan for the call to action. And I'm not sure if you guys can hear my audio. I hear it's breaking up pretty bad. Is it good now?
It's good.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so we are ready to move into our call to action now for Iran. Lauren, if you could paste that document into the chat. There it is. Lauren just posted that document. I'm going to share my screen now and walk you through the actions we're taking now. Marcy's already got her phone out. She's ready to go because she is a pro. So here is the document, Sanctions and Blockade Day of Action, Iran. 3 actions, once again, just like we did for Venezuela. The first one, if you've already done it, no need to do it again, but it doesn't hurt. Tell Biden to lift sanctions for COVID relief. This is the same petition we were signing during the Venezuela program, and we'll put it out there again for Yemen after this. Please sign this, share it with your friends, get it out there. That is our first action. The second action is to tell your reps and senators to urge Biden to support rejoining the JCPOA. I know there's 70 reps or senators who came out and urged him not to do it without preconditions. That's unacceptable. We need to get them back in for the safety of everybody. And JCPOA is uniquely tied to sanctions. So the second action is this simple: email your representative and senators form, rejoin the JCPOA with Iran without preconditions. As always, feel free to change up the headline, to add your own words, thoughts, feelings into the body of the email. That goes a long way, and it helps, and it just feels good to get those things out and to make sure your representative hears you and hears what you really want to tell them. So 2 simple actions: sign the petition, share it around, use this automated email link from Roots Action to send an email to your representative and your senators. Super easy. Just hit submit. I've already done it this morning because I tested them all, so I'm not going to do it again. And then our third action, once again, is to call your representative and your senators. 3 calls if you can do them all. That would be awesome. So much appreciated. As always, super simple. Call the Capitol Hill switchboard 202-224-3121. If you're unsure who your senators are, if you're unsure who your representative is, there are links. And Lauren, if you could just keep posting this document as we go, so it's always there. You can find your senators and your House members here, or you can just ask in the chat and we'll look it up for you real quick and let you know. The script for this, we'll leave this up for a little bit so everyone can see it, but I urge you all to open it on your own computer as well. is a little bit longer than the previous one, but it is all still pretty simple. We are urging the Biden administration to issue a worldwide temporary general license to allow all countries and locations sanctioned by the U.S. to be able to easily import all related medicine, medical supplies, and vaccines to facilitate international relief efforts related to COVID-19. This is very similar to the petition that we were signing as well as the first action. And then we're also supporting in this script, we're also supporting HR 986, which we are doing all day, which is the Robust International Response to Pandemic Act in the House and parallel legislation in the Senate when it exists. And then as always, end those phone calls with a thank you and be polite. It's the way to do it. That's how you get listened to again. If you have any questions or if it's not working for you, please let us know in the chat and we will try to help you work through it. You make sure.
Thank you, Ryan. And once we're done here, we're gonna take a trip to Yemen with Dr. Joman.
That's right, Dr. Joman and Yemen coming up next, and there'll be a bunch of us in there asking questions and whatnot. That should be fun. Again, this stuff's all really important. AOC did a live stream a couple weeks ago where someone asked her the importance of making these phone calls. And she made it really clear that these representatives, senators are constantly saying, well, I don't hear that from my constituents. Make sure they hear the issues you want them to hear. Make sure they do not have that excuse. That's why these calls and these emails are so important. If we don't say anything, they don't hear anything, and that's their excuse not to do anything. So we are counteracting that with calls like this, volunteers like all of you making these calls and sending these emails. So you're all much appreciated.
And I want to thank you, Dr. Rod, for being here, participating in this discussion with us. I've definitely learned so much from you, and I look forward to working with you closely on this issue.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.
Awesome. Good. Marcy, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to.
I muted. I just wanted to you both. I want to thank Dr. Rod and thank Hania and Ryan for a fantastic hour. I learned a lot, and we have much work to do, and I look forward to doing it.
Thank you, Marcy. Thank you so much. What I would really love to hear from everyone is once they make their call, sign their petition, or sign or email the Biden administration, I'd like for you to drop in the chat that you've done all that is requested, so we can encourage everyone else to do the same. There's 58 people, participants on this call. Again, let's take a quick break and we come back to travel to Yemen together.
Danette, I hear you on Correa's voicemail being full. That's a common occurrence with Senator Padilla in California as well. So there are a couple senators and representatives who are particularly bad at cleaning out their voicemail boxes. we will get on to Yemen here in just a few minutes. So hang tight, everyone, as you finish up your actions, and let us know you've done them in the chat.
Ryan, I think we're almost ready for Yemen.
I agree. I think we can move into Yemen. We had a lot of people taking the actions, which is good.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Lauren, for the music there. That has added a nice effect. I might start doing that on my calls now moving forward.
That actually, I'll tell you, that has so I just to kind of give a quick shout out to Marcy Vinograd, who is just a force to reckon with. She is the pioneer of taking action on calls, normally with Code Pink Tuesday calls that we host every Tuesday. And we just decided to add per Medea Benjamin music to our session. So this actually works. So thank you so much, Marcy. And I see myself typing, but I'm not typing in the chat. Hania said done, 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 and I'm not even calling anybody. If you just typed in the chat and your name is Hania, can you please change your name to your own? Thank you. So do we have our panel of speakers, Dr. Ademi and Dr. Joman with us?
Still to get them off mute. 1 second.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Danette. This is really incredible. And we have so many people on the call. I am you. Okay, wonderful. Well, if we do have our speakers, Lauren, if we can go ahead and spotlight them, please.
We have one, at least, and their co-host. You can go ahead and unmute.
I actually see both.
Okay.
I see
Hi.
Dr. Ademi and I see Dr. Joman. It is an honor to be in this space with you, standing in solidarity with Yemen and everyone who's struggling. I have to say, for me, these past few days have been extremely difficult. Going through the history of sanctions in Iran, a country of over 3,000 years of history and culture, and to tie that in with the pain and suffering that people in Yemen are facing. It's been very nostalgic. And so I thank you, whoever is on this call currently staying here with us, making these calls, because your solidarity means the whole world to us, right? And so it is with great honor for me to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Shireen Al-Ademi, who is an assistant professor of education at Michigan State University. Since 2015, she has also been advocating for the end to the US-backed war on her country of birth. That's a hard task to take. Yemen, through and this has been done through writing, interviews, and talks. You can find much of her writing on Yemen in these times. Dr. Shireen, I welcome you here to this space. Take us please through what's happening in Yemen at the current moment. 400,000 children are starving. If you can share that experience with us, I think it would make a huge impact.
Thank you so much for having me. I could share slides if that's okay. If not, I'm happy to talk through what's been going on. Okay, looks like I can share my slides, but it's easier for me to talk through slides just because I think that, you know, instead of hearing me talk all the time, at least you get to see some visuals and it gives me some cues. But I want to give you a little bit of background about Yemen to contextualize what's going on right now. So Yemen, as many of you may know, is the origin of ethnic Arabs. It's a country where 30 million people live and they speak mostly Arabic. And the split, and I intentionally mention this religious split, not as to highlight it as a split or a schism, but to actually see that this is not a sectarian conflict at the root of it at all. Yemeni is 60% Sunni, Shafi'i mostly, and about 40% Zaydi Shia. And prior to the war, over half of them lived in poverty on less than $2 a day. And I bring this statistic up because it highlights why Yemen is today the world's worst humanitarian crisis. There are crises all over the world. Why is this particular one so terrible? And it's because even prior to the war, many people were living in poverty, and Yemen relied on imports for 90% of its needs. So the other contextual piece is the long division between North and South, thanks to colonialism. And so the North used to be called, North was the under the capital Sana'a. It was under the Ottoman Empire until 1918, after which it came under the Mutawakkalite Kingdom of Yemen until a military coup ousted the monarchy in 1962, and Yemen became the Yemen Arab Republic in 1962. On the other hand, in the South, where I was born, in the capital Aden, it was under British rule from 1839 until 1967, so quite a long time. And the resistance in the South to British rule eventually led to their withdrawal a year before they had intentionally or intended. And it became the Middle East's first and to date only Marxist country, the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, which lasted until 1990. So in 1990, both parts of the country united. And fast forward to 2011, which I think is probably the catalyst for many of these events that are happening right now. The people of Yemen saw their neighbors in Egypt and in Tunisia revolting against longtime dictators, and they too went in the streets to peacefully demonstrate against President Saleh, who at the time had been the president of North Yemen since 1979 and the president of a united Yemen since 1990. And the peaceful protests, unfortunately, were co-opted by March when violent clashes erupted between President Saleh and his former allies in the former elite political parties in Yemen, who saw their moment for a power grab, essentially. And it led to an assassination attempt, which he survived. And he transferred power to his vice president, Hadi, who is currently the UN recognized president of Yemen. I want to note that Hadi's term was supposed to be for 2 years. He was the interim president. People say he was elected, but it was really an appointment because it was a one-man election under this deal negotiated by the Gulf countries. And Saleh remained the most powerful man in Yemen, who didn't have to answer to any crimes and was in command of large portions of the military. But the agreement also left out different groups like the Southern separatists and the Houthis, who were this northern movement who had clashed with Saleh in previous years. And I know I'm condensing a lot in this short time, so I'm happy to answer other questions in the Q&A. What happened in August of 2014? So by this point, Hadi's term had expired. He was granted an extension. And then his government removed fuel subsidies. So the Houthis, or the Ansarullah, they began massive protests, which led to essentially a takeover of the capital, Sana'a. And surprisingly, the army didn't intervene, which seemed that this was another alliance about to happen between Saleh and the Houthis. By January, they had taken over the presidential palace to pressure Hadi, and he resigned. And despite all of this turmoil, I want to highlight that an agreement was on the table. So this is a quote from Jamad bin Omar, who was the former UN Special Envoy for Yemen. And he said in a recent Newsweek article, he said, after 10 painful weeks, a compromise was found covering the shape of the executive and legislature, security agreements, and the timetable for transition. A deal was on the table. 2 days later, with no warning, the airstrikes began. So enter Saudi Arabia, our neighbor to the north, who has long battled Yemen or interfered in many political conflicts in Yemen, including civil wars. For example, in 1962, they backed the Northern Monarchy for 8 years. And in the Southern War, and so South-North War in 1994, they backed the Southern separatists. So this was not new, but this was the most overt intervention of Saudi Arabia to date. And with Hadi's support, who had fled to Saudi Arabia and remains there to date, they began to bomb Yemen. Now, the coalition is comprised of many countries, as you'll see over here on this list. They also have ground troops that are mostly Yemeni mercenaries and UAE-based ex-Blackwater mercenaries. And the US's role in this is maybe not very obvious to some people. They might wonder why the US is involved in Yemen. And I want to highlight that about 6.2 million barrels of oil and oil products travel per day to Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which is controlled by Yemen. And if you were paying attention to the news not too long ago when the ship was stuck at the Suez Canal and it halted international shipping for quite a while, you'll see over here, Yemen is also a strategically important location because that ship would have gone through Bab el-Mandeb to be able to enter Europe, and then also Asia, goods traveling through Asia. Asia also traveled through Bab el-Mandeb Strait. And this was also at the just after the Iran deal. And so the Obama officials felt like they had to work with the Saudis and appease them in what was thought to be a very short war. So US complicity is involved with, is seen with weapon sales. So there were about $115 billion sold by the Obama administration to the Saudis, and somewhere around $110 billion, probably less than that, but that's what Trump was bragging about. And the US trains soldiers and pilots, they advise military personnel, they repair and maintain vehicles and aircraft to the Saudi coalition. They supply about 70% of Saudi's weapons. They provide targeting assistance, so they have US generals in the command room. They up until the end of 2018, the US was fueling Saudi and UAE jets mid-air. They provide logistical support, intelligence sharing, which supposedly ended as of February of this year. and importantly, this naval blockade, but also a land and air blockade. So I want to highlight that according to the dictionary, a siege is a military blockade of a city or fortified place to compel it to surrender. And I highlight this word because unlike sanctions, where they're targeted, in Yemen, what we're seeing is something that's more akin to ancient warfare, ancient siege warfare. The US Navy defines blockade as belligerent operations to prevent vessels and or aircrafts of all states, enemy as well as neutral, from entering or exiting specified ports, airfields, or coastal areas belonging to, occupied by, or under the control of an enemy state. This is exactly what's happening in Yemen. And unfortunately, it's part of a pattern of widespread and systematic targeting of civilians, as a UN report highlighted in 2016. So essentially, in the early days of the war, after destroying Yemen's air force, the coalition began to target civilian areas, including hospitals, homes, schools, mosques, factories, gatherings, you name it. And it also began to target food and water facilities, including factories, plants, agriculture, and infrastructure like roads and bridges. And despite all of this, in April of, that should say 2015, a UN Security Council Resolution 2216 recognized, which was basically drafted by the Saudis. And if you read the resolution, you'll see that the Saudis wrote this resolution. They recognized the intervention and specifically called on Saudi Arabia and the coalition to inspect all cargo coming into Yemen via sea and land to prevent armed transfers, supposedly from Iran to the Houthis. And so this has led to a justification by the Saudis for this blockade, because they not only stop, arms supposedly from entering the country, but they also control all goods and fuel and medicine and even people from entering or leaving the country. So currently all but 2 airports in the country are open. None of these airports are in the north. So the north is where about 70 to 80% of the population lives, and it's largely under Houthi control. And commercial trade has been severely restricted. As I said before, Yemen used to import 90% of its goods. 80% of Yemenis, as a result, have become reliant on aid. But of course, that also has been used as a weapon by the coalition and by the Trump administration, who in August of 2020 cut all aid, USAID, to northern Yemen. And under the guise of this arms embargo to the Houthis, the Saudi-led coalition still uses 2216 to justify their naval blockade. A recent CNN investigation confirmed the fuel embargo. I mean, this has basically been denied by many countries or just ignored completely until recently, when Naama al-Bagher essentially smuggled herself to enter Yemen and did this investigation and showed that there's not only a fuel blockade, but also this fuel blockade was creating worse conditions and famine conditions in Yemen. And despite this, the Biden envoy, the special envoy to Yemen, Tim Linder-King, actually denied the existence of a blockade. So he's repeating Saudi lines. And interestingly, there's a contradiction here, because while Saudi is saying that there's no blockade, they're also highlighting the fact that they just allowed 4 ships to enter as evidence that there's no blockade, but they're controlling what enters and what doesn't enter into the country. So the humanitarian crisis is the worst in the world. There have been at least 112,000 people who've been killed. 50% are on the brink of starvation. This year, 400,000 children under the age of 5 are projected to starve to death if nothing changes. And this adds up to a child dying once, one child under the age of 5 dying every 75 seconds. Sorry, this is really difficult because these are numbers, but really they're human beings, right? Because so many people are trapped in the country, there are 3.6 million at least internally displaced people. 24 million are in need of humanitarian assistance just to survive. 70% don't have access to healthcare or clean drinking water. So you see diseases like cholera flourishing, and I'm sure Dr. Jaman is going to speak more about that. And half of all Yemeni children suffer stunted growth. So this is what we're dealing here. This is what we're dealing with. And of course, the airstrikes have killed many, many people. And these numbers are all underestimates, but the effects of the blockade have been, the main driver of loss in Yemen. I want to highlight that the World Food Program, whose director David Beasley is a Republican, a Trump appointee. He said to add to all their misery, the innocent people of Yemen have to deal with a fuel blockade. For example, most hospitals only have electricity in their intensive care units because fuel reserves are so low. I know this firsthand because I've walked in the hospitals and the lights were off, the electricity was off. The people of Yemen deserve our help. The blockade must be lifted as a humanitarian act. Otherwise, millions more will spiral into crisis. And Martin Griffiths of the United Nations said that fuel imports haven't entered Hodeidah since January. It's vital that obstacles to imports and domestic distribution of fuel for civilian use are removed. I call on all the parties to prioritize civilian needs above all else and not to weaponize the economy. So there's finally this admission by humanitarian organizations that this is a weaponization of the economy, and yet the special envoy to Yemen continues to not only deny the blockade, but also not be able to answer basic questions about whether the US is still involved in Yemen, despite the Biden administration's announcement in February that he has ended offensive operations in Yemen. So the fact that they can't answer this question, I think makes it clear that they are still supporting the blockade, they are still supporting offensive operations in Yemen. So I want to highlight that we really need to move here. Congress needs to be in charge and not to give up its congressional authority. Under Trump, they passed the Historic War Powers Act. They need to be doing this right now. They need to lift the blockade on Yemen unconditionally. And I'm really going to ask people to push this issue with their Congress elected officials in the Senate and in the House. Of course, we need to be thinking about reparations, not just charity to the people of Yemen. But before any of that can be dealt with or even thought about, we need to lift the blockade immediately and stop all bombing of Yemen. Thank you for your time. I'm looking forward to questions and discussion. But if you want to reach me, you can email me at aladimi@msu.edu, or you can follow me on Twitter, where I focus on Yemen mostly.
Thank you, Doctor, for sharing your story. It's always it's harder for us who live through the pain and walk through those streets as children, right, to see the suffering of our people. So I admire the work that you do and advocacy that you lead. Hopefully we can ask you for a couple moments at the end of the call to lead the call to action. Perhaps we have one already that is designed, but your input in that script would be tremendously helpful. And I'll have the same ask of Dr. Aisha Joman, but I'll hand it over to Ryan to introduce Dr. Joman as our next honorable speaker, and we'll go to Q&A.
Yeah, first, just want to say, Dr. Al-Aldimi, that was really wonderful to hear, and appreciate it. And those slides are really important. I'm glad you did show them. And I feel like that's something someone else was saying in the chat. That's something everyone needs to see. So just much appreciation. Thank you so much for being here for that. It was,
thank you.
Yeah. Next up, we have Dr. Aisha Juman, who is the president of Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation. Dr. Juman has over 30 years of experience in public health, including viral vaccine, preventable diseases, cervical and breast cancer research, surveillance, maternal child health and nutrition, primary health care, and women in development. So, Dr. Juman, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much. I'm honored with all of you.
Thank you so much for joining us. And with that, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I also I'm sharing slides because I think it's important for people to see as I speak. This is a picture of a child in one of the health centers that was featured in Hunger Wars, the movie. It's Oscar nominated, and I hope they win this Sunday. I always like to start any presentations about Yemen by showing how beautiful Yemen is. This is the old city of Sana'a. It's a UNESCO heritage site, and it's the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. And so Yemen has a rich culture and rich history. It's believed to have been built by Prophet Noah. I want to start my presentation with some quotes from Hanaji, who is a humanitarian aid worker, a Yemeni humanitarian aid worker in Yemen. She talks about how the war started, and they woke up to these airstrikes unexpectedly, in Yemen. And like Shireen said, there was a deal on the table when the airstrike started, but also not just the airstrike. She said a siege was imposed on all the country and the airport was closed. The sky is the property of Saudi and other countries of the lead coalition. We are prisoners in our home. It's not allowed to move out before getting the approval of the Saudis, and they most probably will reject, if we ask to leave. I know when I travel to Yemen, I have to submit my name to the Saudis for approval to get into my own home country. And then she goes on to say, after the siege, most of the company closed and thousands of employees became jobless. So this is an economic warfare on Yemen in addition to the airstrikes. I just got this from a UN report that was published this month. So these are the new figures. The figures in Yemen continue to go up, and unfortunately all the time. So there are 20.7 million of the 30 million people in Yemen who are in need. Shireen said there were about 3.6 million internally displaced. Now they are at 4 million. And there are 12.1 million who need help now. Again, this is a report from CNN by Naama Al-Baqir, which she says, famine has arrived in pockets of Yemen. Saudi ships blocking fuel aren't helping. This is from April 23rd, and it's from Forbes, and it says, this Ramadan, which is a fasting month, children in Yemen are struggling to survive. Half of all children under age 5 in Yemen are likely to suffer from acute malnutrition in 2021, and that aid agencies are working in Yemen. However, I continue to say that aid cannot sustain a population of 13 million people. We need to have people help themselves. And also aid, people become hostage to those who donate. And most of them are, unfortunately, also are in the coalition in the war on Yemen. This is another UN report where it says millions of Yemeni facing a death sentence. And this shows the destruction also of the airstrikes in the country. This is from UNAID Chief Mark Lowcock, where these are direct quotes from February 18, where he says, Yemen is speeding towards the worst famine the world has seen in decades. 16 million people in Yemen were going hungry, and 5 million of those are just one step away from famine. 400,000 Yemeni children under the age of 5 are severely malnourished. Those children are in their last weeks and months. They are starving to death. So if he said they were, in their last weeks and months, and this is in February 18, I suspect that many of these kids have died by now. This is to show you the impact of the blockade on Yemen. The UN has what they call a commercial commodity, a tracker to see what gets into Yemen. And they monitor fuel and food, although everything else is blocked, not just food and fuel. So in the blue line is food, and the red line is fuel. What Yemen needs monthly is this line here, the blue. What Yemen needs in fuel monthly is the red line on the top here. And as you can see, Yemen never reached even about 50% of what they need in fuel since July 2016. And when they talk about food is not blocked, that's actually not accurate. Because as you see that most of the months here, Yemen did not get enough food. Yes, we see some at the end, at the end of 2020 and the beginning of January 21, we saw an increase of amount of food getting in, but that wasn't true in November or December for that matter. But then we also have a restriction of fuel, so making movement of food that gets into the port to where it needs to be very difficult. These are detained fuel vessels off the coast of Jizan that are destined to Yemen as of April 22 of this year. And we can see what the vessel's name, what they contain, and the shipping port is actually UAE. So these ships are not coming from Iran. They're not coming from Venezuela. they're actually coming from one of the coalition partners on the war in Yemen. And it shows when they received a UN certificate that they don't contain any weapons, which is the date here. And so this is the certificate number. The UN says these ships don't have any weapons and should be allowed to go into Yemen. And this is the date when that certificate is granted. However, look at how many days they've been held. And so one of them is 144 days, 144 days, and so forth. And these are for public consumptions. The last one is for private sector factories. So the 4 ships that Shireen talked about were actually for the private sector and none were for the public consumptions. I would like also to note here, there were actually 8 ships and 3 of them just got tired of waiting and decided to ship somewhere else. And this is one of the purposes of delaying these ships, is that the ships will give up and try to go somewhere else. But also the other impact of this holding of ships is the Yemeni then have to pay fines for the delays of the ships, and it's passed to the Yemeni customers. This is just to show you an average fuel that went through Hodeidah port since January 2020. And we can see that a lot of the times, especially from January to February, very little was allowed to go into Yemen. This is Lisa Grande. She was, during the Senate testimony this past Wednesday, she was the former humanitarian coordinator for Yemen. And a lot of these words are actually direct quotes. I didn't have the quotes around them, but they are the direct quotes. I just edited them so they are shorter. She basically says there is an economic warfare on the people of Yemen. She said they are coercive measures directed at destroying the economy by the Saudi-led coalition. They control number and timing of all ships entering Hodeidah port. Like Shireen said, 90% of what Yemen needs, especially for the north, get through Hodeidah. They stop payment of salaries for public servants in areas under Ansarullah by moving the central bank to Aden. The restrictions on all line of credit, quotas on importation of basic goods, including fuel and cooking gas, controls on capital flow through central bank and on foreign exchange, and import restrictions on industrial material. For example, the Saudis bombed every single cement factory in Yemen. Why would they do that? Because they don't want any reconstruction of what they are destroying. They destroyed every single bridge that connects the capital Sana'a with the other governorates. So they've done a lot of destruction. Then she also goes to say measures are main drivers of the humanitarian crisis. So all of this, they did that because they want to induce famine. So this is a human-made famine. It's purposefully done to, in the Middle Ages when they would do a siege so people can surrender. And then she goes to say it's an immiseration of the population areas under the control of Ansarullah. They ruined many economic and financial enterprises. I know of many businesses who had to close and fire their employees because they cannot import what they need for their businesses. A lot of the healthcare facilities who have equipment, they can't even repair them because they don't have spare parts to repair them. They've starved public and national institutions of necessary resources, and at least 130,000 civilians have died because of this blockade and economic warfare on Yemen. And this is a huge underestimate. I also want to talk about my own experience at Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation. We got a donation from Novartis for every single case of leukemia in Yemen, and leukemia mainly affects children. Through the Max Foundation, the cost of the medicine, and it's free, it's given to us free, is about $15 million. We have not been able to get it to Yemen. These are kids, leukemia children kids, their families send me their pictures, hoping that if I see the pictures, I'll be able to get the medicine in. I have not been able to get the medicine in, and it breaks my heart that we have medicine that's been held for over a year, and many of these kids have died because of it. Also, the blockade on airports, the Saudis will do something once in a while to get a public relations, bonus out of it. So Sana'a Airport has been closed since 2016. The UN and many international organizations have pleaded with them to open it just for medical evacuations. They did allow it after 3 years of negotiations. They allowed 2 flights only to get out of Yemen, and only allowed 27 people out of over 35,000 people who need medical evacuations. But they got the public relations stunt, all over the news. And after that, they closed it. And so people die because they're not able to get the medical care they need. Again, in terms of call for actions, we definitely need to end the blockade in Yemen and open all points of entry. We need to support a just and inclusive peace and increase humanitarian aid to Yemen and pressure the Saudi and UAE specifically to pay their fair share in reparation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jaman. That was fantastic. Really interesting stuff there. So much going on there. Hania will be back shortly. She had to restart. Her computer's having an issue. We do have a couple questions for you, and this would be for both of you, Dr. Jaman and Dr. Al-Adimi. First off, just thank you. It's just so incredible. It's wild to hear about that. And the first thing that comes to mind is, this is a genocide, right? Is genocide the correct word for what's going on in Yemen?
I mean, I've used that word because I don't know how it's not, right? This is the systematic targeting of an entire people based on who they are, based on their ethnic origin. And I know that people like to say that it's complicated because, well, the UN recognized Yemeni president is actually, allowing this to happen. And so there's this UN cover essentially, but that doesn't matter because the reality is that the Saudi-led coalition, with the help of the United States and all these other Western countries, are imposing economic warfare, a blockade, and siege warfare in its most primitive form, like we mentioned, and trapping people in so many ways, and denying them basic access to their basic rights, and then also bombing them. And so I don't see how this is not a genocide. And I also want to note that, the Biden administration recognized the Armenian genocide today for the first time. And I just can't stop to think about the hypocrisy that the US is actively involved in perpetuating and committing genocide against the people of Yemen by actively supporting the Saudi-led coalition. And yet we don't have those terms. It's as though they don't matter, except for certain political purposes.
Right. And the idea of finally coming around and claiming the Armenian genocide was genocide 105 years later, when there's one happening right now, is particularly striking. Dr. Jaman, do you have any thoughts on that, on this being a genocide, and should we label it that? Should we be loud and clear in labeling it that?
Oh, absolutely. It is a genocide. The fact that when they say 113,000 people have died of famine, I'm an epidemiologist. I work with numbers. That's what I do for my day job. And all my projects are actually in Yemen. And I know from the pictures that I receive from people in villages that nobody reaches with these aid organizations, it is a genocide. I mean, a siege is done to starve people. The Yemeni people are not starving. They are being purposefully starved. So definitely it's a war crime. Definitely it's genocide. And we should be calling it what it is because the US, unfortunately, is part of that. We are complacent.
Yeah, I completely agree. And you've both put it in such stark terms here, and the numbers are just wild to see. And luckily you're both doctors, so you can perhaps speak to this. Dr. Al-Adimi, how has COVID made this situation worse? How has it compounded the suffering that's happening in Yemen right now?
So I can speak to that. I'm not that kind of doctor. Although
I'm sorry.
that's okay. I teach teachers how to teach. But I think Dr. Jaman is probably the best person to answer this because she's so well connected with the healthcare in Yemen.
Perfect. Dr. Jaman, how has COVID made this situation worse?
COVID has made it worse in so many ways. We see how it affected even people in the US, which is the richest country in the world, and how many people became homeless, many people became hungry. We do a lot of food distribution in Yemen because of of the famine, and we try to encourage people to stay in their homes at least, during these times because of the spread of COVID-19 in the country. And we've had more than one family in many places in Yemen, from Aden to Saada to Sana'a, who told us that they actually would rather die of COVID-19 than die of hunger, because hunger is a much more, painful death. So people are very concerned about it. In terms of the numbers, when COVID struck Yemen, Yemen didn't have any reagents. Of course, the labs weren't equipped. They didn't have any medicine. They didn't have any oxygen, factories or enough to serve the country. So Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation was actually the first organization, even before UN agencies, that sent COVID-19 reagents that were donated by the Robert Koch Institute in Germany, in Berlin. And even getting those is quite a challenge because, of the blockade. The population now, with the second uptake or the second surge, we've seen a huge, increase in number of cases and number of deaths. And on top of that, we also see a lot of the healthcare professionals have died. In the first wave, there were over 110 when they were counting healthcare providers. And so you have a health system that's already disseminated. We have over 50% of the health services are not functional or not functional at all. And then you have, on top of that, many of the health professionals dying from COVID-19. There are a lot of people, of course, dying in their homes and nobody knows about them. I keep getting questions, even from people in Yemen, why is COVID hitting mostly the doctors and the politicians? And my answer to that is because these are public figures, we know about them. There are 10, if not 100 times more people who are dying in their homes that nobody knows about them. So they don't have the capacity to take care of cases when they become cases. The people don't have the capacity to seek health services, and they die in their homes.
That's awful. We have Hanya here back now, who's going to hop in and ask some questions now. Oh, I have to ask you to unmute. So sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Jaman and our sister Shireen. I wanted to ask this question because what happens during a war, blockade and sanctions, what is created usually in countries is what's called sanction profiteering, right? So it's really difficult to know what organization to trust, what organization sends aid. I would love for you to talk about your organization, Dr. Jaman, and the great work that you're doing on the ground in Yemen. And I think all of us are really anxious to know what to do from here. I mean, I'm dying to learn more. Please lead us.
Thank you very much, Hanya, for your question. So I established Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation in 2017 in response to the war in Yemen and the famine and all the problems that we talked about. But even before 2017, with the first airstrikes on Yemen, I knew that people are going to be affected. And I was sending my own money to different parts of Yemen through my contacts in the health services. Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation works throughout Yemen, and we work with Yemeni on the ground. So all the people that we work with in Yemen are volunteers, and also all the people in the US who are helping us are volunteers. 100% of the donations that we get go to provide services. We have identified 6 major areas for our work, and that is 70% to 80% of our funding go to provide food. So we do a lot of food baskets. We also identified education as an important, area to support. So every year we support children with school bags and school supplies to ensure that that's not a way for them not to be going to school. We also identified water as a main project for us. So we have several water-related projects. You can read about them on our website. And we have identified supporting orphans, because in a war, a lot of men die and are left, and kids are left with women to take care of them. And a lot of these women are in areas where there is no work for them. So we have over 600 orphans that we give them monthly allowance to make sure that they at least have a roof on their homes. We've asked how they use the funds. Many of them said they use it for housing, medical care, and education. And I think what is unique about our work is the model we use, where we work with people in the areas where we are doing the service. We use the reports that are published by the UN to identify which areas have the highest, for example, malnutrition rate. And so those are our target area per month. So every month we identify those areas. We contact our local people in those areas, and we ask them, because they know the area more than me and more than someone who is in Sana'a, for example. We just distributed this morning, food baskets in Aden, and we get from them the list of people who are in need. We get estimates of, the prices. We verify, and we also document. So we have a monitoring an evaluation of the work that we do. And it's, because we don't have any overhead, we're able to do a lot more with that. And then also because we are work with local merchants, when they know this is for charity, we actually get the best prices. I mean, when I read the prices published by the UN, for example, for a food basket, and what I see what we get a 1/3 off what's published. Because, merchants in Yemen also feel like, okay, if you're doing this for charity, we want to also help you do that.
Dr. Ademi, if you could lead us into our call to action. I know that we have some designed, and we'll share that with you shortly. But please tell us what is necessary, what is needed, and what we need to really ask our Congress members. I know there are a few hunger campaigns that are happening at the moment, but I think the impact really happens from us forcing the Congress members and to urge the Biden administration to end the funds to Saudi. So take it away, please.
Thank you so much. And I vouch for Dr. Jaman's work in Yemen. I know people who work with her organization, and they tell me that she reaches areas that no other organizations do. So every bit counts, but I always recommend her foundation as well. And I want to just highlight that, maybe this isn't this group of people, but people always say, well, there's always these problems in Yemen, and there's a civil war, and it's complicated, and the war will continue even if the US lifts its hand off. And sure, all of these things can exist. Also, we don't need our own government's hands in this conflict. And no civil war can cause this much damage to people. I didn't live in Yemen for very long. My family moved when I was 12. But in the time I lived in Yemen, I lived through 2 civil wars, and no civil war imposes a blockade on people because everybody starves together. You don't destroy infrastructure because then you can't drive on that road or bridge either, right? And so the foreign intervention is what's caused so much of the suffering in Yemen, above and beyond but what Yemenis could have done to themselves without foreign intervention and without foreign backing. And so I want to highlight that our responsibility is then to, and we don't have any control over what local groups in Yemen do, whether it's the Houthis or the Hadi government or the Islah Party or even ISIS and Al-Qaeda. We in the US don't have any control over that. And so I want to highlight that where we do have control is our own elected officials, who every single day that they do nothing about Yemen is a day in which they're complicit in their role in Yemen. Even the well-meaning ones who passed the War Powers Resolution, it's been 2 years since the War Powers Resolution has passed, and now they're backing off because they feel like, well, Biden has promised an end to offensive operations. Congress asked the Biden administration to clarify and to provide exact, information about what has ended and what hasn't. And it's 3 weeks past the due date, and Congress hasn't received a response yet. And so what I've always been worried about, and what I'm seeing right now, is that this is a rebranding of the war by the Biden administration. There's still going to be these deals made with Saudi Arabia to save face, because frankly, we're dealing with the most incompetent coalition in the history of ever, who, with 6 years of backing from the world's richest countries, and they themselves are the world's richest countries, haven't been able to take over people who don't even have an air force or a navy, right? And so what we need to end is our own complicity, and that has to happen legislatively, not just taking the words of a president who doesn't even have authority to go to war to begin with. And so that's what we need to be urging. And then with US leadership, I'm hopeful that, we need to be pushing really for the Biden administration to use diplomacy to talk to its own allies, the British, the Canadians who are still selling arms, all, the rest of the world, to back off from this, because what we're dealing with here is war crimes, and have been dealing with war crimes and genocide. And so if we throw these words at them long enough, they might stick. And you mentioned hunger strikers, and Iman and Hanan Saleh, who are from Michigan. They went to DC and were on hunger strikes for over 3 weeks, and have highlighted the importance. And this is, an act of desperation for these Yemeni American women with Liberate Yemen, Yemeni Liberation Movement, to put themselves through this, to highlight how desperate we are for action. It still remains largely ignored, but you know what? There's been so much movement over the past 6 years, and I'm confident that with all of our work collectively, we can continue to put pressure and our own complicity in this war.
And so with that said, I am urging every single one of you to please make your donations, your contributions to Dr. Jomon's organization, and share her website on social media, and tag us, and we will go ahead and reshare. Let's go ahead and spread the word. Without further wait, Ryan, let's go ahead and go into call to action. I really want for us to, for 10 minutes, contact every single one of our Congress members, write our letters to the Biden administration, urge the administration to end the Saudi-led war in Yemen. And I hope you stay with us throughout our call to action, Dr. Jilman and Ademi. And Brian, take it away, please.
Thank you so much, Hanya, and thank you to all our guests today. What a good day. We learned a lot. It's been heavy, but that's why we're taking action, because that's what we have to do right now. So we really appreciate Dr. Juman, Dr. Al-Adimi for coming in and talking about Yemen to us. I know I learned a lot. Lauren, if you can, please share the action doc for Yemen so we can take action right away. Call our representatives. There it is. Lauren just shared a doc, and we'll share it several more times. I'm going to share my screen now so that we are all looking at the same thing here. Sanctions and blockade day of action for Yemen here. 3 actions again, like we've been doing all day. The first one, which has been the same for Venezuela, Iran, and now Yemen, is to sign our Lift the Sanctions campaign petition. Please sign this. Share it on social media, get it around. What I found the biggest, not the biggest, but one of the largest obstacles we're facing in this fight is people don't know anything about it. And it's not popular enough. And nobody, even the left, even the progressives, we're not talking about this every single day like we should. Hashtag Genocide Joe. We got to do something. We got to make this administration react. We have to make them know that we think that what they're doing is genocide. And this is one of the ways we can do that. So please sign this petition and share it on social media, because people will learn about this just from reading this. There's so much good information in here. So that's our first action. Our second action is to email Congress to end the war on Yemen. Clicking on that, and you get an action page from Roots Action. And this is a pre-written email. It already knows who I am, but if you've never filled out a Roots Action action, it'll ask you for your name and address. You put that in, it'll automatically identify your senators and your rep, and it'll automatically send an email to those people, and you will get responses a lot of the time. So we encourage you to change up the subject line if you'd like, add your own personal thoughts, feelings, emotions into the body of the letter. That helps. That goes a long way into spreading the word about what we're trying to do here. And then lastly, call your representative. This is the most important thing we can do. Call the Capitol Hill switchboard 202-224-3121 and use the script below. This is specifically for your representative, your House rep, not your senator, because we are talking about specific House resolutions in this. And to support Congressman Meek's resolutions, HJ 15 and 16, to block new weapons sales to Saudi Arabia. All of this stuff is really important. Sign the petition and share it. Email your congresspeople and senators, and call them here using this script. You can also feel free to add in your own words. Speak from the heart. Yeah, this one was an emotional one. I really appreciate Dr. Aladimi and Dr. Juman for going through this, because this one was tough to hear what the United States is doing, and it's just awful, and it's truly awful. And the numbers are staggering. If you don't know who your representative is, ask us in chat. We will look it up for you. We also have this link right here below the phone number. I'll get this all down to one page, actually.
I was about to say, if we could get that number, we can all start calling. So you are on the call. We have 41 people here. Let's pick up our phones and make that call.
Yep, let's start making calls. And if you have any questions as you do this, just ask in the chat. We'll do our best to answer them. Oh, did we lose the script? I'm going to go back to sharing that script so we see it. Cheryl's asking if we can send the individual actions. Lauren, would you be able to paste the individual actions for action 1, action and action 2? Thank you, Lauren. And Dr. Bill, that's a great point. if your representative is actually good and supports these things, call them and thank them as well. That's a really good point. And that goes a long way as well.
And what I will do is I will also share the White House website for everyone who, or anyone who wants to write the Biden administration.
Yeah, and for writing the Biden administration, you have two really easy options. You can copy the phone script.
Ryan?
Yes.
You were muted.
I'm sorry. I was saying for writing the White House, it's very easy. Hania will put in that link there, and then you can just copy the phone script or the email script, whichever one you wanted to send, and fill in the information and change it up there, and that will work. Thank you. And I'm going to
It is 3:29, and we are at the end of our program. I want to thank you, participants, for staying with us today and helping us make these phone calls and uplifting the message of each country and our struggles really in those regions of the world. But I also want to extend my gratitude to Dr. Alademi and Dr. Jomon for being here and sharing their wisdom with us. We hope to continue these calls on a monthly basis, travel to different regions of the world to raise awareness on what's happening, and come together as a coalition and a movement to be able to highlight some of the atrocities that are unfortunately led by the US government and its allies around the world. Are there any last words, Dr. Jomon and Dr. Alademi, that you want to finish with?
I'm grateful for everyone's advocacy. I really believe that this is up to us to end this war, and I'm confident that we could. There's so much more that we can learn about Yemen. I encourage you to read as much as possible, but the basic components of this are not difficult. People are dying, they're being starved, they're being bombed, and our bombs and our policy is doing this, bombing and starving. And so thank you all for keeping those 30 million people in your actions and holding them close.
I want to echo what Shireen just said. I also am grateful for the opportunity to be with you today. I also want to stress that we need to de-link the blockade from the political solutions or negotiations. 30 million people in Yemen can be held hostage to negotiations. We know the political negotiation takes years, and we also know that sometimes they don't end up in any resolution. So we cannot wait for that to happen to lift the blockade now. And then, of course, the political negotiations can continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jomon and Dr. Ademi for being here, participating in today's panel of discussion. And thank you to my co-host, Ryan, who has been a tremendous help throughout the process, and Lauren Fialco, who has been quietly doing all of the tech and making this possible for us to record this, as well as to spread this message across different social media platforms. I thank you from the bottom of my heart for your allyship, for being here. We will continue to fight. We will continue to raise awareness on these issues that impact the Middle Eastern countries and all countries around the world. And we hope to be with you in solidarity, hopefully next month, for the next 3 regions that we're going to travel to. Thank you again. And Ryan, if you have any last words, and Lauren, if you want to unmute yourself also, if you're still here, we'd love to hear from you, and then we'll say goodbye.
Yeah, I would just say real quick, thank you all. I mean, we had amazing speakers. This was a great program, a great day, learned a ton. I really appreciate everyone taking action today. And I think we will follow up with links to these actions so you can quickly take the actions, share them with friends, whatever you need to do. So yeah, just much appreciation to everyone who joined us today. And thank you, Hanye, for organizing this.
My pleasure. Lauren. Nope.
Glad to help. Awesome to be behind the scenes for something so powerful. So yeah, let's spread these links around so more people can see this and take action. And thanks everybody for being here.
Onward, everyone, and thank you so much for your participation. We'll see you next month. Have a good day.